honourable friend, the Prime Minister, has extended negotiations, engaged in conversation with the Leader of the Opposition, precisely to find a solution through the impasse.
Martin Day.
No deal didn't appear on any ballot paper in 2016, and it was ruled out by all the main Leave campaign groups. So will the Secretary of State agree with me that it would be totally unacceptable to crash out without a deal without first putting it back to the people?
Here, here.
The honourable gentleman is quite right. The House has shown no inclination to leave the EU without a deal, and that's why my right honourable friend, the Prime Minister, is looking for a way forward and engaging with the Leader of the Opposition on precisely that issue.
Jenny Chapman.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Leaving without a deal would affect everybody, and not least, Mr. Speaker, our dentists. And I hope you'll find it in order to raise this issue about dentistry and no deal at this point. A third of the 6,500 European qualified dental registrants intend to leave UK dentistry. The British Dental Association President Mark Armstrong said the government has failed to even acknowledge the scale of the crisis. And I know ministers have their own recruitment and retention issues at the moment, but isn't the President of the British Dental Association right, and what is the government going to do about it?
I'd like to pay tribute to my former colleague, the member for Daventry. He was a wonderful minister, and it's a shame that he is he's left us. On this issue of professional qualifications, in the withdrawal agreement, and it's always been a stated aim of the government, that there will be mutual recognition of qualifications. This is not something which is controversial, and it's something which I think will assure many people, many EU citizens in our country, that they can continue without any interruption or uncertainty to pursue their professions.
De Grant.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The government have had any number of times to take no deal off the table. Last night, Parliament had to take the almost unprecedented step of starting to pass legislation fiercely opposed by the government in order to put the Parliament and these islands where the government should have put us a while ago. Last week we had the astonishing spectacle of the government chief whip going on the record saying the Prime Minister had got it all wrong. Does the Secretary of State agree with his chief whip?
Here, here.
I think what my right honourable friend, the Prime Minister, has got right is the fact that we need to have a solution to the impasse, and that's why this week she's very openly invited the Leader of the Opposition for talks to track a way forward.
Peter Grant.
Speaker, it's very noticeable the Prime Minister is still refusing to talk to anyone who might say anything she disagrees with, but we'll see if it comes out of these talks. But given that the very clear will of this House is that no deal must be avoided, given that this Parliament is now in the process of passing legislation to prevent no deal from happening, is it tenable for any Minister of the Crown to continue to be actively promoting a no deal Brexit that's been rejected by Parliament and it was never actually endorsed by the people in the first place?
So my understanding with respect to my honourable friend listening to diverse views is that my right honourable friend, the Prime Minister, spoke to the First Minister of Scotland yesterday and has been engaged in conversations with her. And the position of the government has always been the same. We favour a deal. We want to leave the EU with a negotiated deal, but it would be irresponsible for the government not to prepare for no deal, because that's still something that might happen. And indeed, Michel Barnier said that it was likely this week. So it's exactly the right thing for the government to prepare for this scenario of a no deal.
Ronnie Cowan.
Question number 12, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I regularly meet ministers from the Scottish and Welsh governments, and on Monday this week spoke to Graham Day, MSP, and Jeremy Miles from the Welsh Assembly. My Secretary of State also meets his counterparts in the devolved administrations. Indeed, he met his Scottish and Welsh counterparts on his very first day in the job.
Thank you very much. Scotland voted overwhelmingly to stay in the EU and to retain free movement of people, which is essential for our economy and social well-being. What account has been taken of those facts in developing the UK's Brexit strategy?
been a huge amount of engagement through the Joint Ministerial Council and the Ministerial Forum, which I co-chair with the Scottish and Welsh governments. And there are a number of issues that were raised in Scotland Place in Europe, where actually our shared policy is to pursue, for instance, cooperation with Europe on universities. But the honourable gentleman will recognise that Scotland's share of UK immigration is actually very low, and that it is, as the Migration Advisory Committee have made clear, only really possible to have an immigration policy for the whole of the UK.
Anna Johnson.
12, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you. The government has undertaken extensive work to identify the legislation essential to deliver our exit from the EU. In fact, as I speak, I think almost all of the SIs, 93% of them, required for a functioning statute book on exit day have already been laid.
Diana Johnson.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. So the government have failed to pass the trade bill, the agricultural bill, the fisheries bill, the financial services bill, the environment bill, and even failed to introduce the EU withdrawal bill. So doesn't this go to show that those people who think that we're ready to leave in a no-deal situation on the 12th of April, it just shows that the government is not prepared for that at all?
Spot on.
I would reject the assumption behind the question. As I stated at the dispatch box, almost all of the SIs required, and it was something like 600 of the SIs that were required have been passed. 93% of them have been passed. She's quite right to suggest that there are bills currently in Parliament which are being discussed and which are going through both houses. All of these bills provide for a range of negotiation outcomes, as she knows, including a no-deal scenario.
Stephen Timms.
Mr. Speaker, isn't it now inconceivable to pass a meaningful vote before the EU Council next Thursday, and therefore unavoidable to seek a lengthy Brexit delay and hold European Parliament elections?
I think given what we've seen in the last few weeks, I would never use the word inconceivable. I mean, anything, as you know, can happen. I'm confident that we will get a deal through. I'm hopeful of that. Because that's the only way that we're going to get a negotiated exit, an orderly exit from the EU.
David Perkins.
14, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you. He will be aware, the honourable gentleman will be aware that we've had extensive meetings across the country. I myself have seen many companies across the country, and we continue to recognise the importance of UK manufacturing and of maintaining a close trading relationship with the EU. As the political declaration sets out, we have already agreed to establish a free trade area for goods, and we recognise that manufacturing is an essential part of the economy.
David Perkins.
It's not really much to do with my question, which is about regulatory standards. Waitrose Lanchai, a Chesterfield-based industrial weighing machine manufacturer, had to spend around £50,000 having all their product recertified in the Netherlands because it will no longer be certified, recognised for sale in the EU after we leave. Isn't the cost that UK manufacturing are paying the most serious example of what the failure of this government to come up with a trade deal is actually the impact that's having on British businesses?
Well, I'll tell the honourable gentleman about failure. What is actually crippling and showing the uncertainty, which is increasing the uncertainty of his manufacturing sector, is his repeated rejection of the deal, which would actually have an implementation period and give certainty and direction to the very companies that he is seeking to represent in this House.
Melanie On.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. The Minister said that anything can happen, and Total Lindsay Oil Refinery contacted me this week just in the event that there is a no deal to warn me about the risk of the equivalent of Chinese steel dumping, but with US gasoline. If we end up with 0% import tariffs, that will result in a loss and a downgrade of up to 900 jobs in my Great Grimsby area. Does he agree that this will irrevocably damage our local economy?
So the question I would like to ask myself is, given her concern, I'm answering her question. I'm answering her question. Is is, given that she has so much concern for the manufacturing interest in her constituency, why on earth has she rejected on 3 occasions the only deal which is going to provide certainty and a degree of consistency for the companies that she seeks to represent?
David Duquette.
To number 15, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The UK government has been unequivocal that in any scenario, including no deal, EU citizens and their family members living here by exit day will be able to stay. We want them to stay. They're our friends and our neighbours.
David Duquette.
For his response, but can the Minister specifically reassure EU citizens living in Banff and Buchan, and indeed across Scotland, that contrary to suggestions in letters being circulated by the Scottish National Party, the UK Government does value them, wants them to stay and is committed to upholding their right to live and work in the United Kingdom? I've seen the letter.
My honourable friend is exactly right, and it is hugely irresponsible for people to stir up fear in the way that we have seen there. EU citizens are highly valued members of their communities and play an integral part in the economic, cultural and social fabric of the UK. I enjoyed engaging with EU citizens from the Nordic countries in a recent visit to Edinburgh, where we were making very clear that we want them to stay, and we have designed the settled status scheme to help them to stay.
The honourable gentleman from West Bromwich wish to...
Well, a sense of anticipation is now being built up. Mr. Barry Sherman.
16, sir.
Thank you. Obviously, manufacturing is absolutely vital to everything that we do. We remain committed through our industrial strategy to make the UK the best place to start and grow a business. There are now 3.5 million more people in work since 2010. And I have to say this, it seems very remiss, I think, for members on party opposite to complain about the uncertainty when they have rejected the deal not once, not twice, but 3 times. This deal will provide the certainty which his manufacturing interests would recognise, and they appreciate that.
Very Chairman.
We all had a late night last night, but this is a zombie Secretary of State with zombie ministers. When will they wake up to the fact? And we had yesterday, the manufacturing group of MPs, which I chair, yesterday had a leading professor from the business schools, both Sheffield and Birmingham, said any way that we leave Europe, we will have a 4 to 5% drop in GDP. But in those constituencies and towns that voted leave, their drop in GDP will be the crippling 17 to 20%. It may not include Spelthorne, where I grew up, but it is going to devastate this country's manufacturing base.
To say 2 things. First of all, we're not zombies. I'd like to confirm to the House that that is the case. But secondly, Spelthorne has manufacturing interests like his own constituency, and the manufacturing interests in my constituency always say to me, back the Prime Minister's deal, back certainty, and let's get this thing over the line, and let's move on with our lives. That's what they want.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The highly integrated supply chains in both motor and the aviation industry require convergence and regulatory alignment with product manufacture in both the EU and the UK. What guarantees can the Minister give us that in the event of the UK leaving the EU without a deal, that we will have a role in shaping the future regulatory framework?
Obviously, it's been the repeated intention of the government not to leave without a deal. And he will know from the withdrawal agreement that Part 3 of that agreement deals extensively with the kind of regulations that would be in place in the course of the implementation period, which, if the deal goes through, will give us another 20 months to negotiate a free trade agreement.
On First Glove.
Number 18, Mr. Speaker.
Minister.
Thank you. My friend will appreciate that a second referendum, in fact, would have a very corrosive impact, not only on our politics, but also on the trust. People have mentioned trust very many times. There was a clear instruction in 2016 to withdraw from the EU, and that's what the government remains absolutely committed to fulfilling.
First Glove.
I'm very grateful to the Minister for that answer. And beyond that impact, what assessment has he made of both the democratic and financial impacts of pursuing such a change in policy?
My honourable friend is quite right. Holding a second referendum would create enormous amounts of uncertainty that would undermine the strong economic achievement of the government and of our businesses, and it would essentially take us back to square one. It would result in more delay at a time when the public simply want to get politicians to deliver on what they've promised.
Wilson.
Speaker, after the talks with the Labour Party leader yesterday, the Chancellor this morning has said that a second referendum is more likely. Are we beginning to see yet the start of another U-turn by a government which has abandoned all of its promises to to go forward with no deal, to have no border down the Irish Sea, and to ensure that we leave the EU on the 29th of March?
With respect to the second referendum, as I said to my honourable friend, it is government policy to honour the referendum in 2016. That's what we've been tasked to do. That's what we are 100% focused on. This issue of the second referendum, frankly, I think is a red herring. It's not something that we countenance, and we want to deliver on the 2016.
Tim Lawton.
As part of the political declaration, the Government has negotiated an agreement on the future relationship for financial services that would be of greater depth than any other the EU currently has with a third country, whilst also enabling our financial services sector to take up the global opportunities on offer.
Lawton.
I'm grateful to Secretary of State. Is he aware of the latest Reuters Brexit City Tracker Index, which revealed that last year no less than 7.6 million square foot of new leases were signed in the City of London, a record. The market is currently within 5% of its record high, and fewer than 2,000, or 0.5% of city jobs, have either relocated or jobs being substituted elsewhere on the continent. When is this Armageddon going to happen because of Brexit?
Mr. Speaker, as a former City Minister, I take a close interest in these issues, and he's absolutely right to draw the House's attention to some of the developments we've seen in recent months in the City, and also the opportunity that the City has in growth areas of finance, green finance, for example, being a key opportunity, fintech being another, and there are very good opportunities for the City in a post-Brexit world.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. There seems to be some confusion about customs union. So can the Secretary of State for DEXU, my right honourable friend, confirm that a customs union would not cover the way in which we regulate our financial services, the way in which we fish, the way in which we farm, or indeed freedom of movement? So it should be perfectly possible to discuss customs union without using any F words.
Well, my honourable friend is absolutely right. There's one sort of tweak around fishing and fish, but other than that, I absolutely agree with her. And also, just to remind the House, if you take financial services alone, that contributes, I think, from memory, around £71 billion in tax to the UK economy, and so the opportunity of an economy which is 80% services post-Brexit, where we can take a more bespoke approach, will enable us to maximise the opportunities that are on offer.
Rachel McLean.
Question number 20, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. After much urging by the UK, we are pleased that all member states have now given some public assurance to protect the rights of UK nationals, and we will continue to call on member states to fully reciprocate our unilateral offer. The government supported the amendment by our honourable friend for South Leicestershire and has sought the EU views on ring-fencing the citizens' rights parts of the withdrawal agreement. Michel Barnier has responded, and we are now considering our response to his letter.
Rachel McLean.
I thank my honourable friend for his answer. I am deeply opposed to the legislation that was passed last night in this House. I strongly favour leaving with no deal if we can't actually leave the EU. However, I would be very grateful if my honourable friend would update me on what steps he's taking to protect the rights of our citizens in the EU and also the EU citizens in the UK should we actually leave with no deal.
Where I agree with my honourable friend is that we should absolutely protect the rights of citizens and do everything in our power to do so, and we've always been steadfast in our commitment to protecting those rights. Today we have announced a further series of measures to protect UK nationals in the EU and those who choose to return to the UK after exit. There's important measures on social security coordination, a 7-year transition period for UK nationals in the EEA and Switzerland to continue to access student finance and home fee status in England, and a transition period for UK nationals who return to the EU with their non-UK family members, for those family members to apply to the EU settlement scheme.
Rick Hands.
Very welcome news that Germany will be unilaterally guaranteeing the rights of UK subjects in Germany that came out this week. Could my honourable friend tell us which, if any, of the EU 27 are not known to be guaranteeing the rights of UK nationals?
My honourable friend raises an important point, and we do welcome some of the steps that have been taken. He mentions Germany. I think the Czech Republic have also been very clear in reciprocating our unilateral offer. There is a varied playing field within the European Union, it is fair to say, and some member states have not been as generous as perhaps we might like them to be. I think it is something which we will continue to urge them to meet the generosity of our unilateral offer and continue to explore what we can do reciprocally to make sure the best possible protections are in place for our citizens.
Topical questions. Mohammed Yassin.
Topical number 1, please, Mr. Speaker.
Mr. Speaker, since I last updated the House, my honourable friend, the member for Daventry, has left the government. I would like to take this opportunity to pay tribute to his outstanding service as a minister. He will be greatly missed in the department and by his colleagues, but I know he will continue to serve his constituents of Daventry in an exemplary way. We have also, since our last departmental questions, had a large number, not just of debates with my right honourable and learned friend in this place, but also of votes. But the House has not been able, as of yet, to find something that it is for, as opposed to lots of things that it is against. That is why my right honourable friend, the Prime Minister, set out on Tuesday that this division, this lack of conclusion cannot continue and drag on. We have reached out to the leader of the opposition to see if we can agree on a plan to leave the European Union with a deal, and those discussions will continue later today.
The public knows that withdrawal agreement is a long way from the Brexit that was promised. Does the Secretary of State agree with me that the public have been let down badly, and whatever agreement is drawn up by this Parliament should now be subject to a confirmatory public vote on real rather than fancy Brexit deal?
Mr. Speaker, he seems to confuse the winding down arrangements, which are the withdrawal agreement, with the future deal. And the fact that the EU have been clear, firstly, that any deal reached will need to include a withdrawal agreement. Secondly, that that withdrawal agreement is not open to renegotiation. And therefore, any deal to move forward in an orderly fashion needs to come with a withdrawal agreement. And that is why it was so remarkable that the honourable gentleman voted against the withdrawal agreement, because whatever deal he needs in order to leave the EU requires a withdrawal agreement. So the only conclusion is perhaps he doesn't want to honour his own manifesto, and perhaps he doesn't want to leave at all.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Can the Minister confirm that it's still this government's position to take us out of the common fisheries policy, with the UK participating in annual negotiations as an independent coastal state no later than December 2020?
Yes, I'm very happy to confirm to my old friend that is our policy, and it was good to meet with the Scottish Fishermen's Federation in his constituency to hear why they see that policy as a sea of opportunity.
Yes, Dharma.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Normally I complain that in this session we don't actually get any of our questions answered. We've moved on this morning, Mr. Speaker, because instead of answering questions, the ministers are now asking themselves questions or inventing questions they'd like to answer and then answering them. So I'll be careful how I frame this question for the Secretary of State. Last week, the Prime Minister said, and I quote, "Unless this House agrees to it, no deal will not happen." It was a very important commitment, particularly now we're 8 days from the 12th of April. So the simple question for the Secretary of State to ask himself is this: does he agree that unless this House agrees to it, no deal will not happen?
Well, what the honourable lady was referring to, and it was played out in the debate in the House yesterday, that where the House of Commons passes a law, and subject to the other place, that is the position of the vote last night, then in law, and bound by the ministerial code, ministers will need to abide by it. But at the same time, as my right honourable friend, the Prime Minister, has always been clear, the decision by this House not to approve the withdrawal agreement means that any extension will need to be agreed by the EU Council at 28. That does include the United Kingdom, but it can be opposed by any member of the European Union. So it is not solely within the control of this House whether it leaves with or without a deal. It is also subject to the decision now of the EU 27.
Well, Mr. Speaker, when we do get a question and answer, it gets interesting, because that's a rowing back on what the Prime Minister said. When she said, unless this House agrees to it, no deal will not happen, that was not in the context of the bill last night. That bill hadn't even been drafted. Yeah. It was a proposition she made as a general proposition in the debate last week. And I hope the Secretary of State is not rowing back, and I'd like him to confirm that he's not rowing back, because otherwise we have elicited something here of some importance. But can I also go on to ask him whether he now regrets voting against an extension of Article 50 in this House on the 14th of March? That was an extension beyond the 29th of March. And whether he now regrets voting against the Cooper-Letwin bill last night, because had the House followed his vote, does he appreciate that it's highly likely we'd be in a no-deal situation right now?
Well, first, Mr. Speaker, we have the oddity of starting by accusing the ministerial team of not answering questions, and then starting his next question by pointing out that indeed we have answered it in an interesting way. But putting that to one side and going to the substance, as I pointed out to the House, one of the defects of the legislation passed last night is there could be a scenario where it increases the risk of an accidental no deal, where the EU Council take a decision to offer a different extension to that agreed by this House, and under the terms of that legislation, that would then need to come back to this House the following day for approval, by which time the EU Council would have concluded. Now, I don't think that was the intention of the Right Honourable Lady, the member for Normanton, Castleford and Pontefract, but it is a possible outcome. Now, it will be subject to their lordships to decide whether they want to correct what I regard as a defect, although his ministerial colleague says that no doubt they will just nod it all through without scrutiny, without addressing that defect. As to his second point, it is a statement of the law that I was alluding to, and I do not differ at all from my right honourable friend, the Prime Minister, who has always been clear that ministers abide by the ministerial code, and I'm sure the right honourable learned gentleman would expect no less. And thirdly, to the issue of the extension, we have addressed this in previous debates because the three amendments were all defeated by the time we got on to the fourth vote. A further commitment had been given to an amendable motion for the following week, which had been addressed. But the bottom line, Mr. Speaker, is I want to respect the referendum result. I think asking people to vote for MEPs 3 years after they voted to leave is damaging to trust in our democracy. The answer for the benches opposite is why they keep voting against everything when their own manifesto said they wanted to respect the result.
Thank you. The Digital Single Market Copyright Directive is on its way to becoming law in the EU. This could have significant implications for the UK's IP-rich creative industries, and particularly publishing, whose successes are underpinned by a gold standard copyright system. Can you clarify how consistent the UK's copyright regime will be with the EU's when, or perhaps I should say, if we leave?
I'd like to thank my honourable friend for this question. The UK's IP regime does indeed represent a gold standard internationally, and that will not change as we leave the EU.
George.
Thank you very much. The Prime Minister has confirmed that the future declaration is not legally binding. So what assurances can the government give us on trade tariffs, on rights at work, on food standards and environmental protections that will be binding on whoever ends up negotiating our permanent deal with the EU?
As the Honourable Lady will know, there will be ample opportunity for the House to legislate during the passage of the Withdrawal Agreement Bill. There is legal wiring, as she knows, through, for example, Article 174, in terms of best endeavours, the good faith obligations under the Withdrawal Agreement and how they connect there. The House will be able to choose, should it wish, to put into legislation negotiating objectives, if that is one of the issues that the House looks at in future. So there will be opportunities for the House to legislate, but the point is, she has been opposed to the withdrawal agreement that the EU say is necessary for any deal, and you can't get on to the future relationship unless you have a withdrawal agreement.
Swain.
Regulatory alignment is a euphemism for them making the rules and us having to implement them, isn't it?
right honourable friend, as always, is short and to the point. And what he correctly identifies is the risk of rule taking. We talked earlier about financial services and the tax take from that sector alone. And I think the UK taxpayer that underwrites the liabilities of a sector such as financial services will have concerns if the rules are being set in countries in Europe rather than in this Parliament.
Mr. Speaker, when in 2017 the ex-Brexit minister, the member for High Wycombe, claimed so many DEXU staff are on loan from elsewhere in the civil service because the nature of the department is temporary, I bet he didn't foresee his own departure, along with 5 other ministers, latest one being the no-deal minister saying that his work was done now. I wonder, when does the government see the job of exiting the European Union will be complete, and that this young ministry that's experienced so much churn can then be wound up?
Well, as the Prime Minister has already informed the House, Mr. Speaker, during the next phase of negotiations, it will be the Department for Exiting the European Union that will lead on those negotiations. But as she's also well aware, we need to get on to those negotiations in order that the Department can undertake them. And I think that is what businesses up and down the country want. They want this uncertainty to be brought to a close. They want us to get on into the implementation period for the certainty that will be. But it's also what EU citizens living in this country and UK citizens in Europe want to see.
Ms. Pauline Latham.
Can the Minister outline what conversations he's had with the Home Office to ensure the settled status scheme works effectively for EU nationals?
I'm grateful to my honourable friend for that question. It is a very important issue to make sure this works as effectively and smoothly as possible. The Home Office is providing assisted digital support over the phone at over 200 centres across the UK and at home with a trained tutor. Applications can also have their identity verified by the identity document checkout at over 50 locations, one of which I'm pleased to see is in my constituency, and by post. And I'm pleased that my right honourable friend, the Home Secretary, confirmed recently that Apple has said it will make the identity document check available on their devices by the end of the year.
Emma Lewell-Buck.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. The government's been warned that children of EU nationals who are looked after or care leavers will fall through the gap when it comes to the settling of their status. These are vulnerable children in the care of the state, yet this government, as their corporate parent, doesn't even know how many of them there are, is refusing to give them automatic settled status or waiver fees of those eligible for citizenship. Why is that?
Absolutely disagree with the Honourable Lady in terms of the government's attitude to this group. We want to ensure that all those who are eligible for settled status, and particularly children, are given a smooth and orderly process. And I'm happy to take up her concerns with the Home Office, but I don't agree that the government doesn't take its responsibilities in this regard extremely seriously.
Julia Lopez.
In International Trade Committee, we heard from the Minister that should we ever get there, it will not be DIT negotiating our future trading relationship with the EU, but I presume DEXU. If this is the case, can I ask the Minister what lessons will be learned from the fundamental strategic flaws of this opening phase of negotiations, and what detailed discussion is underway with DIT about the impact of whatever DEXU negotiates on our ability to build fruitful...
Well, my honourable friend is right that in terms of the future trade agreement, the future economic partnership with the EU, that it will be my department that leads on that, but she'll also be aware that my right honourable friend, the Trade Secretary, will lead in terms of our trade deals with the rest of the world, and he and I speak on a regular basis. In terms of lessons from phase one, I think as in the corporate world, as in government, there are always lessons, things that have gone well and things from which we can improve from the first phase. It was a major new endeavour for government to undertake, and we have had a number of discussions within the department to ensure we take those lessons on board.
Mr. Speaker, North East manufacturers have achieved great success as part of integrated, just-in-time, pan-European supply chains, where, as one manufacturer put it, their stock room is somebody else's delivery van. They are now having to stockpile as a consequence of this Brexit chaos. So this has implications for their cash flow and finances. What help is he looking to provide them? And what hope of future economic integration can he offer them in the case of a deal without the customs union?
What I would say to the Honourable Lady is that I have travelled in the North East, not quite in her constituency, but seen chemicals firms, petrochemicals industry, and what they say with one voice is that they want a solution to this impasse, just as we do in this House. And they want to have a deal, they want to have the implementation period, and they want to move on from this.
Rachel McLean.
Forcing the UK to take part in European parliamentary elections would show a fundamental lack of respect for our democratic process, wouldn't it?
So, well, Mr. Speaker, I already addressed this point, which is, I think, 3 years after the country voted by record numbers to leave. I think there is a very strong desire to ensure that we get on with it and do so. Am I right? And my friend, the Prime Minister, has compromised. She has reached out. We are endeavouring to deliver on the will of the British people in that referendum vote and on the manifesto commitments of the both main parties.
Order. The Honourable Lady, the member for Redditch, appears to be on the receiving end of mentoring from her right honourable friend, the member for New Forest West. I think it will probably be extremely helpful. It would be to any member, and it's a great tribute to the right honourable gentleman. Diana Johnson.
Mr. Speaker, can the Secretary of State just enlighten the House as to what he thinks has actually gone well during this first phase?
Well, I think what has gone well in this first phase is we have an agreement with the EU that gives certainty to EU citizens, that respects our legal obligations, and which will ensure that there is no hard border on the border of Northern Ireland. In part, one of the achievements of both parties, but particularly party opposite, was the Good Friday Agreement. It's why one of the members in Northern Ireland gets so agitated with members on her benches over the failure to withdraw the withdrawal agreement. We have a deal. It is on the table. It is the only deal that the EU are willing to offer.
The clear and solemn commitment in the Conservative Party manifesto on which the Secretary of State and I were elected was, as we leave the European Union, we will no longer be members of the single market or customs union. Will he ensure that the Prime Minister does not renege on that commitment at the European Council next week?
Well, the right honourable gentleman correctly identifies that in our manifesto. He'll also be aware that the manifesto gives a commitment to have a deep and special partnership with the EU, and it is that balance we are trying to see. That is why the Prime Minister brought forward a deal that both delivered on the referendum result on things like control of our borders, a skilled immigration system, control of our fisheries, control of our agriculture, putting an end to sending vast sums of money to the EU, but did so in a way that also respected the fact that 48% of the population didn't vote for leave. It is that compromise that hasn't been pure enough for some members of my own benches, the government benches, to support it.
Thank you. Order. Urgent question. Dawn Butler. Well, we'll take points of order afterwards. Yeah.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. To ask the Minister for Women and Equalities if she will make a statement on the government action to close the gender pay gap.
Minister Victoria Rankin.
Good morning, Mr. Speaker, and I'm delighted that this UQ has been called today because we are only a few hours away from the deadline landing for private sector employers to publish their gender pay gap results. Last year, the government introduced groundbreaking regulations that required large employers to publish for the first time the difference between what they pay their male and female staff in average salaries and bonuses. For the first time in this country's history, the boards of large employers have had to have conversations about how they treat their female staff. And by making this information publicly available, we have empowered employees to see the scale of the pay gap where they work and hold their bosses to account. The vast majority of companies are eager to tackle the gender pay gap themselves. This is why the government has provided guidance to help employers develop action plans to close their pay gaps. But reporting is just the start. It's crucial that all employers use this data to identify the barriers women face and take action to break down those barriers. We're supporting business in doing that by publishing evidence-based guidance on how employers can diagnose the cause of their gap and the practical actions they can take to close it. We recognise, though, that overturning structural inequalities in women's pay cannot be done overnight. Most companies won't see a dramatic reduction this year, but what matters is that they're taking the right action to drive change in the right direction, and progress is being made. Beyond reporting, this government is actively working to support women in the workplace and close the gender pay gap. We are supporting both women and men who have caring responsibilities through increased childcare entitlements, promoting flexible working and shared parental leave. We're working with business to support and increase women's progression to senior positions. We are leading by example and aiming to make the civil service the country's most equal and inclusive employer by 2020. And we're helping women access every profession by working to increase the number of women taking qualifications in STEM subjects. Change will not be easy, but we have only to look at where we are now compared to even 10 years ago to see that a future of fair and equal pay is now within reach. And this should be a source of pride for us all.
Dawn Butler.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I'm not sure if the Minister's reading the same statistics as I've been reading. Analysts so far have shown that the median pay gap has actually got bigger than it was last year. And on average, the companies that have been reported this morning show a 78% pay gap that favours men. And I do think that the government and the public sector should be leading by example. As we know, the public sector deadline was the 31st of March. And the initial analysis of this year's public sector report shows that the pay gap has not been narrowed. And shockingly, the Department for Digital, Culture, Media and Sport reported a 22.9% pay gap compared to just 8.2% in 2017. And the department we just heard from, the Department for Exiting the European Union, its gender pay gap increased from 8.9% to 14.5% in 2018. And I could go on with DFID and the Health Service, but basically the pay gap is getting worse. And I'm sure once we start looking at the race pay gap, we will see that that's even more distressing. I think that the Minister needs now to stand at the dispatch box and say that not only does improvement needs to be made, but we need to start taking the next steps and ensuring that companies have action plans that are part of the reporting procedures, and that if they do not try to close their gender pay gap, that they face additional fines. This is what a Labour government has committed to do. And I think at the moment, unfortunately, it's just a gender pay gap, just a tick box exercise. And I do hope that EHRC will be given more funding to be able to issue sanctions.
Well, I'm so pleased that the Honourable Lady has, as I say, asked this urgent question this morning. I have to say she's fallen into the trap of quoting figures before the deadline has passed. It passes at midnight, and she will know, because we had the same conversation last year, that the last day of reporting is the day where everybody suddenly realises the deadline's here, and they send their reports in. And we have seen, I think, overnight already a 2% increase with private sector employers reporting. So we mustn't, and I will not, talk about figures in terms of private sector employers until the deadline has passed at midnight tonight. I'm delighted that she's raised the point of public sector deadlines and public sector gender pay gap. I join her in admonishing those who have not yet reported. I think it is disgraceful that public sector bodies are not complying with the law in meeting their deadline on Saturday last week. And I'm sure, in that case, that she, after this urgent question, will be straight on the phone to the chief executive of her own council, Brent Council, because as of this morning, Brent had not reported. The deadline was Saturday. They have had some time to realise that the deadline has passed, and they have not yet reported. So I hope she will be communicating the very strong message she has communicated just now at the dispatch box to her own council. To reassure her, I will be writing to every public sector employer after this deadline has passed to remind them not only must they comply with the law, but also that I expect them to issue action plans, because it seems to me that if we are going to tackle the gender pay gap, then we must lead by example in the public sector. And I'm sure Brent Council, once it's realised that it's acting outside the law at the moment, I'm sure not only will it publish its gender pay gap, but it will ensure that its action plan is as detailed as the Honourable Member opposite expects. In other news, continues. We have more than 10,500 businesses having this conversation about gender pay gap, about how they treat their female staff. And it is a delight to see so many members of the House here today keen to see that women are paid fairly and properly in their employment.
Several members wish to catch my eye, but the backbench business debates are heavily subscribed, and there is, of course, the business question to follow. So there's a premium on brevity from back and front benches alike. I want to move on to the business question no later than 11 o'clock, so people can take their cue from the Right Honourable Gentleman Member for New Forest West, whose succinctness is exemplary. Mr Philip Hollowbone.
Which sectors of the economy have the biggest gender pay gap and which the smallest?
As I say, at the moment I can't comment on the gap. It wouldn't be right because the figures are coming in still today. But we know that women, half of women are employed in the education, health and retail sectors. Those are the sectors that we are concentrating on in terms of giving guidance to employers as to how to address their gender pay gaps, because we want to get action as quickly as possible to ensure that women are paid properly.
Angela Crawley.
Mr Speaker, now women are key to improving the economy and we already know that, and as a member of the Women Equalities Select Committee, myself and the Right Honourable Member for Basingstoke and many others across this House have sought to hold this government to account. Now the fact is, Women in Work Index found that the closing gender pay gap could boost the economy by $2 trillion, yet this UK government's current position on the index has only shifted from 14th to 13th place. Scotland has been a top performer within the UK on gender pay gap. However, there is still a great deal more to do. Increasing greater pay transparency, increasing early years and childcare provision, representation on public boards. Now, this SNP government has committed to reducing gender pay gap by the end of this Scottish parliamentary term, and to tackle the labour market inequalities. That's a bold aim and it must be matched by this government. So I'm calling on this UK government to go further than just auditing larger companies. Real action needs to be taken to ensure that these larger companies are leading the charge. So I want to ask the Government Minister whether she will support the SNP's aim to lower the current threshold from 150 employees to 150 employees, the introduction of sanctions for employers who do not comply with the current law, and to ask the Minister whether she will match this commitment made by the Scottish Government.
Well, I thank the Honourable Lady for her question. She will know that the gender pay gap figures, that the first year of reporting was last year. This year is the second year of reporting. Although I am impatient to get this gap closed, we do have to acknowledge that it's going to take time for businesses and employers to close it. And so I'd like the data to settle, perhaps for another year or so, before we start looking at reducing the number of employers at which companies and businesses have to start reporting, because we do acknowledge it's an extra bureaucratic responsibility for the businesses. We want to make sure that the large employers are doing their best before we move it down, but I look forward to that work.
The opposite have 13 years to tackle the injustice of the gender pay gap, but failed to do so. Would my honourable friend welcome them, perhaps joining us in welcoming the steps that this government has taken to tackle this historic injustice?
Mr Speaker, I'm very grateful to my honourable friend for her question. And again, you know, at this time in our nation's great history where the public are expecting us to collaborate, to get on with our business and to perhaps lower the heat and the anger in some of our debates, I'm very much hoping that colleagues across the House will be joining us all in welcoming the fact that we have 10,500 employers who are complying with the law, meeting the expectations that they will treat their female staff properly, and I would hope for more joy and collaboration across the House.
Christine Jardine.
How does the Minister believe the Equality and Human Rights Commission can fulfil its commitment to monitor and act against firms that discriminate when its budget has been so drastically reduced?
Well, the EHRC, and I lay on record my thanks to them, did an excellent job last year of pulling those employers who hadn't yet met the deadline, who missed the deadline, pulling them in to ensure that they reported. For some businesses, it was that they just made a mistake or they didn't quite understand what they were supposed to do, and that is why by the 1st of August we had 100% compliance.
Graham.
Thank you very much, Mr Speaker. Does my right honourable friend agree that it's important to check the gender pay gap right across the workforce, not just the boardroom? From my 11 years in industry, I saw often the biggest gaps appeared at the senior management level and also junior managers below the boardroom level. So we've got to have a range of information.
Well, my honourable friend makes an excellent point that this isn't just about board level, although of course that's important. It's about ensuring that when women start on their careers, that they're paid properly and fairly, and the gender pay gap will help address this because it forces employers to look at how they're treating women throughout the entire structure of the business.
No, thank you.
The Minister talks of a future of equal pay, but she knows that cannot happen so long as well-paid sectors like engineering and science are dominated by men and low-paid sectors such as care are dominated by women. So will she not adopt Labour's policy of sector-specific diversity charters so that we can start to address the structural issues in some of these sectors?
I think it starts much earlier than that, Mr. Speaker. I think we have to be giving girls the confidence to carry on with maths in school, with STEM subjects. That's why we're doing so much work on this, to ensure that girls are encouraged to carry on studying those subjects. She's absolutely right to point out industries such as engineering. In fairness, many of the businesses in those very, very male-dominated industries are beginning to get more women in at the low end of the pipeline. But this is going to take time, and I'm just, as I say, I want to bring business with us rather than dictating from on high how society should view their female employees. I think this is as much about cultural shift as it is about structures and legislation.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Will the Minister look at the situation at Christ Church, Oxford, where the Dean has been suspended allegedly for trying to introduce equal pay for men and women?
Well, I mustn't comment on individual cases at the dispatch box, but certainly I'd be very happy to discuss that with my honourable friend in due course. I mean, the message to academia is that we expect our universities to reflect the society in which they serve, and we have a wonderful diversity of students now, and one would hope that our universities will reflect that.
Justin Matters.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. How can we lecture other employers on matters of equality when this place has yet to fully implement the recommendations of the Cox Report into bullying and harassment?
Well, of course, that's a matter for the House. I make this observation. I mean, I've spent a great deal of my time persuading women to take the big step of coming into public life. I think the attitude and the atmosphere at the moment in Parliament is putting a lot of women off, I think. It's pretty toxic. And the predictability or unpredictability of Commons hours can cause problems. This week, my little boy's just started his holidays, and I had a bit of an about-to this morning trying to sort out childcare. But we all do this. And we've got to make sure that the Commons is more flexible in the way that it is so that it can encourage people from across our society to join us.
Tom Pursglove.
Mr. Speaker, looking back at last year's publication, what lessons were learnt going into this process this year?
Well, first of all, I think businesses realise that if they don't do as the public expects them to do, then they will face a great deal of public scrutiny and reputational damage. There was one employer, for example, who did not include their partnership figures in their return, and the public spotted this and called them out on it, and in fairness to that employer, they revised their figures to include the partnerships. So it's this sort of transparency and scrutiny that really will help businesses comply with the law.
I would have expected universities to show leadership on the gender pay gap, so I was surprised to hear it reported earlier this week that they had the widest gender pay gap. If that's true, what's the Minister going to do about it?
Well, I share the honourable member's concern about this, and as I say, I will be writing shortly to every single public sector employer, reminding them of their duty to, first of all, meet the deadline, but also to set out their action plans. I don't think there's any excuse, frankly, for public sector employers who want to lead the world in the way that we conduct our business to not have an idea as to how they're going to address the sorts of gaps he's described.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Does the Minister agree that it's not just a very strong moral case to promote gender pay equality, but there's a very strong business and economic case for promoting diversity and equality in the workplace?
Very much so. Being diverse, drawing on a diverse pool of people for your business and your organisational structures, it makes great business sense. The McKinsey report recently showed that it can add to as much as 15% to a company's success compared to their competitors if they have a diverse workforce.
Mr. Barry Sherman.
Mr. Speaker, the Minister might not be aware that I have a vested interest. I have 3 daughters and 4 granddaughters. Progress has been made, but we need to step up and accelerate the progress that we had. This is a week of celebration, 20 years since the minimum wage. Could I encourage her to use the B word a bit? Tony Blair and the Labour government introduced the minimum wage, did so much to bring more women into this place. Sometimes, could she use the Blair word when she goes on the media?
I wasn't expecting that question, Mr. Speaker. I think I welcome anyone who is committed to ensuring that more women, more people from different backgrounds, of different ethnicities. I welcome anyone who is committed to ensuring that our workplaces, whether political or business or public service, I welcome anyone who's committed to that drive.
Mr. Speaker, the Base Select Committee looked at the gender pay gap immediately after the first round of reporting last year and drew attention to the improvement in economic performance that could be achieved by fully utilising the talents of women in the workplace. But the Minister's already spoken about the challenges some businesses have faced in calculating the figures, and we called for improved guidance to businesses to enable this round to be more easily undertaken by businesses. What progress has been made?
My honourable friend raises a very important point. My officials consult regularly with business to ensure that our guidance is up to date and practical. And if there are any particular parts of the guidance which businesses are unhappy with, please do let me know. But we do, as I say, review it constantly, and we're very conscious as well that the calculations can be, they can be difficult, they can be confusing, particularly if a business doesn't have a direct human resources department, but we're very happy to review it.
Mr. Speaker, last year 19 NHS trusts had median pay gaps of 20% or more. This year 24 did. Why has that happened?
Well, this is exactly the challenge that we're facing with this, that we know that women are one of the 3 sectors that employ 50% of our women who are working is health, it's care. And so the NHS trusts themselves should be looking as to why these gaps have increased as she's described. As I say, I will be writing to every public sector employer asking them for their action plans, and we can help them with drawing up their action plans to make sure that they make a real difference.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Next year is the 50th anniversary of the Equal Pay Act, and yet the gender pay gap still remains too large. The Base Select Committee recommended that to close the gap, there should be mandatory action plans on employers to show how they're going to do it. The government refused that. Can the Minister say why and whether she'd look at it again?
I very much keep it under review. I mean, thus far, we have just under 50% of employers who fall within the gender pay gap reporting regime. Just under 50% have issued their own action plans voluntarily. It's because we want to bring business with us. We don't, I would much rather that employers ask themselves questions as to how they're treating their female staff rather than conducting some sort of tick box exercise, as has been alleged. So, of course, I will keep it under review. If we don't think employers are making enough progress, we will act.
George.
Thank you very much. The Minister correctly identified that good quality childcare is essential for women going back to work. But the number of nurseries closing has risen by 66% in the last year, and only just over half of local areas have enough childcare for parents wishing to work full-time. Will the Minister speak to the Secretary of State for Education about the impact that the state of our early years sector is having on women seeking to work?
I'm grateful for that. Minister. She's right to raise it. I mean, that's why we were so keen to introduce free childcare for children aged 3 and above. The point about local nurseries, I'll happily raise that with the Secretary of State. But also we're trying to encourage businesses and employers to look more imaginatively at how they keep that talent that they may have spent many years training and developing female employees through schemes such as flexible working and also shared parental leave. Those are the sorts of bold schemes that will really make a cultural difference as well as a practical difference.
David Anderson.
Why have 100 health bodies across the United Kingdom seen a growth in the gender pay gap in the last 12 months? And if she's writing to those health boards, what does she expect them to do on receipt of their letter?
I expect them to look at the variety of diagnostic tools that is available on the gov.uk website and to seek advice as to better diagnose and then deal with their gender pay gaps. This is not an insurmountable problem, and those health trusts need to understand that the gender pay gap expectations apply to them just as it does to any large multinational company.
A sentence, please. Jim Shannon.
One sentence, Mr Speaker, yes. Can the Minister outline any discussions held with the devolved regions regarding the implementation of reviews throughout the public and private sector to get a clearer picture of where we stand?
Minister.
Yes, of course. I mean, we are very keen to work with all of our colleagues across the United Kingdom to ensure that businesses and employers are treating their female staff fairly, regardless of where they happen to be in the United Kingdom.
Thank you. Order. Order. I think the Shadow Minister wants to raise a point of order that relates to the exchanges we've just had, and that point of order and that point of order only I'm content to take now. Point of order, Dawn Butler.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. Mr Speaker, I've just contacted the CEO of Brent Council, Carolyn Downs, and she has informed me that Brent Council submitted their gender pay gap report on Friday the 29th of March via the government's own portal. I just wondered if the Minister would like to stand and make an apology to Brent Council.
Minister.
That was not the information I had just before I walked into the chamber. So it seems that the Council, I'm advised that it was not on the gender pay gap portal. Of course, if she's done what she should have done and followed the law, I'm not sure I'll congratulate her. I'm just pleased that she's following the law.
OK, well, we'll leave it there. Thank you. Order. Business question. Valerie Vaz.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. Will the Leader of the House please give us the forthcoming business?
The Leader of the House, Andrea Leadsom.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. The business for next week will be Monday the 8th of April, a motion to approve a statutory instrument relating to the draft Electronic Communications Amendment, etc., EU Exit Regulations 2019, followed by a motion to approve a statutory instrument relating to the draft Trade in Torture, etc., Goods Amendment, EU Exit Regulations 2019, followed by a general debate on UN International Day for the Elimination of Racial Discrimination. The subject for this debate was determined by the Backbench Business Committee. Tuesday the 9th of April, a motion to approve the Burma Sanctions EU Exit Regulations 2019, followed by a motion to approve the Venezuela Sanctions EU Exit Regulations 2019, followed by a motion to approve the Iran Sanctions Human Rights EU Exit Regulations 2019, followed by a motion to approve the Republic of Guinea-Bissau Sanctions EU Exit Regulations, followed by a general debate on housing. Wednesday the 10th of April, a motion to approve the Draft Regulatory Reform Scotland Act 2014, Consequential Modifications Order 2019, followed by a general debate on the 50th anniversary of the Continuous at-Sea Deterrent. Thursday the 11th of April, a general debate on the definition of Islamophobia. The subject for this debate was determined by the Backbench Business Committee. Mr Speaker, as colleagues will be aware, discussions between the two main parties on the subject of EU exit are ongoing. Subject to the progress of those talks, there is the possibility that business will alter, and I will, of course, update the House as soon as possible in such an eventuality. We do want to enable all colleagues to have a break during Holy Week, but I would note that we will need to retain flexibility to potentially sit on Monday and Tuesday of that week, the 15th and 16th of April, and I will, as always, endeavour to update the House about business as early as possible. In the same vein, it is likely that we may need to sit on Friday of next week, and I will update colleagues on this as early as possible next week. Subject to the agreement of the House, Westminster Hall will not sit during Holy Week, following a discussion with the Chairman of Ways and Means, in order to make sure that as many House staff as possible get a well-deserved break. Mr Speaker, yesterday was the 3rd anniversary of the detention of Nazanin Zaghari-Ratcliffe in Iran. We continue to call for her release, and the Foreign Office is doing all it can to make sure this happens as soon as possible. And this week is also Autism Awareness Week, which gives me the opportunity to congratulate all those who've taken part in fundraising events this week and to thank all those working so hard to support autistic people and their families. Thank you.
Thank you. Order, I just point out that today is not as heavily subscribed as sometimes, but the first of the two Backbench Business Committee debates is very heavily subscribed, and of course there is a ministerial statement to follow. So I think the focus today is on brevity. Valerie Vaz.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Can I thank the Leader for the business? I appreciate it's difficult to have settled business, but it's yet again, Mr. Speaker, another sign that the government can't govern because we are, again, the Prime Minister has run down the clock. But I have to say that we haven't had an opposition day. There are backbench debates and there are general debates. So could I ask again for an opposition day? Mr. Speaker, last week I asked if we could have a statement from the government on the timetable for the progress of key legislation that needs to pass through Parliament before exit day on the 12th of April, but the Leader of the House responded by just mentioning the progress of secondary legislation. There are important bills that need their next stages, and particularly the Financial Services Bill. There is a cross-party support for the amendment tabled by my right honourable friends, the members for Sutton Coldfield and Barking, calling for Jersey, Guernsey and the Isle of Man to have registers in place by the end of 2020. This is a crucial piece of legislation to tackle tax evasion. HMRC has confirmed that in 2018, in a clampdown on offshore tax evasion, it received reports about the offshore financial interests of around 3 million UK residents or the entities that they control. Figures from Accountancy Daily say that this involved 5.67 million individual records detailing offshore financial bank accounts. When will the government find time for the report stage of this bill? And could the Leader also update the House if she's confident that all the necessary Brexit SIs will go through the House before exit day? The Brexit process has been a shambles, Mr. Speaker. No solution. Ministers are resigning. And the Prime Minister has decided now she wants to stop speaking Klingon, or should I say Ergon, to the ERG group, and now speaking to the opposition. Mr. Speaker, in her statement at number 10 Downing Street, it was a statement at Downing Street, not to the House, the Prime Minister failed to rule out leaving the EU with no deal explicitly. The Bank of England estimates that the worst-case scenario involves border delays, a loss of market confidence, and the economy contracting by 5%. Nearly 30% of our food comes from the EU, and some of the imports at this time are particularly high because they involved food that we can't grow ourselves, like lettuce, tomatoes and soft fruit. Academics at Imperial College say that 2 extra minutes spent checking each vehicle at Dover and Folkestone could lead to traffic queues of 29 miles on nearby roads. In the meantime, Mr. Speaker, my constituents want to know why since 2010, spending per pupil has fallen by 8%. And the Leader has mentioned it's Autism Week. It was announced today that in the last 4 years, 17% of cuts have been made for those with special needs. Just last week, I saw my constituent. She was in tears because her daughter had to take 2 buses at the age of 11, or have a 40-minute journey just because the local schools are full. Could we have a statement on school places? We had Home Office questions on Monday, but no statement on knife crime. The Honourable Member for Gedling asked if we could have a statement, but nothing has been forthcoming. One question to the Prime Minister is not sufficient. Mr. Speaker, it's more than about public health. It's about giving young people facilities, community places, places where they can find their talents. So could the Leader of the House ensure that we have a statement from the Prime Minister or the Home Secretary on the Knife Crime Summit? Mr. Speaker, it's the 20th anniversary of the national minimum wage introduced by a Labour government and opposed by the Conservative Party. That should be our goal. When will the government implement the real living wage? And we celebrate today the 20th anniversary of NATO, signed by a Labour Foreign Secretary. The Leader will be interested in a report from the Defence Select Committee published today called Missile Misdemeanours, Russia and the INF Treaty. The Chair, my honourable friend, the member for New Forest East, said the continent of Europe is less safe as a result of the Russian decision to develop missiles in contravention of the INF Treaty. We are not a party to that treaty, but the committee said that the government needs to push NATO for a proportional response which sends a firm message. Will the leader find time for a debate on this important report? And Mr. Speaker, you will know that the MOD has instigated an inquiry into the use of a picture of the leader of the opposition as target practice. I am sure the leader will condemn this. Could she ask, while the investigation is ongoing, could she ensure that the following questions are asked of the Secretary of State for Defence? What action will be taken under Section 19 of the Armed Forces Act 2006 against the soldiers on the matter of good order and service discipline? Will the commanding officers and those officials higher up the chain in the Ministry of Defence take responsibility, and how will they prevent this from happening further? Can they confirm who supplied the image, and can they confirm there are no such other photos circulating amongst armed forces? If the Secretary of State for Defence would like to apologise to the Leader of the Opposition or the Prime Minister, I'm sure that will be very welcome. But in the meantime, we'd like a response to those questions. Could I ask the Justice Secretary to meet with my honourable friend, the member for West Lancashire, and quite rightly we paid tribute yesterday on her resilience. She received the House's appreciation. She may have some suggestions about improvements to the trial and the terrible things that she was put under while she was waiting for the result. And, Mr. Speaker, I don't know if you know, but finally we have had excellent ratings on the BBC Parliament channel. I want to thank my honourable friends, the member for Normanton, Castleford, Pontefract and West Dorset, for their great courage in ensuring that the government didn't put our economy at risk with no deal. And again, once again, thank the talented and dedicated staff of this House for ensuring that our business was done. And finally, Mr. Speaker, it is cherry blossom time. I urge honourable members to go outside and look at the cherry blossom.
The Leader of the House, Andrea Leadsom.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I can absolutely assure the honour.
Sorry, I do beg the Leader's pardon. Forgive me, I emphasise privacy. Can I just say at the start, people who came in after the statement was issued cannot expect to be called and shouldn't stand. They shouldn't stand. And we've really got to observe the basic principle of respect. And the leader delivers a statement and it's responded to. People can't then come wandering in the chamber and expect to be called. It's quite wrong. The Leader of the House.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I was just going to say to the honourable lady I would love to be outside looking at the cherry blossom, as I'm sure we all would. And maybe indeed that's what some colleagues were doing before they wandered into the chamber. Anyway, the honourable lady asks for the key legislation, and she specifically mentions the Brexit bills, and in particular the Financial Services Bill. As she will know, we do want to look very carefully at the amendments that were brought back. The Financial Services Bill was actually a relatively straightforward bill that was seeking to deal with some in-flight files during the period of transition for Brexit. And of course, an amendment added to it goes into a much more significant amendment that impacts on the rights of the Crown dependencies. So it's right that the government takes a bit of time to look at that and consider it properly. But of course, we will bring that back in due course. She asks about the Brexit primary legislation, and she'll be aware that in addition to the EU Withdrawal Act, there were 9 exit-related bills that are either in Parliament or have already received royal assent. We've had the nuclear safeguards, the sanctions and anti-money laundering, the Haulage Permits and Trailer Registration Act and the Taxation Cross-Border Trade Act, and now the Healthcare, European Economic Area and Switzerland Arrangements Act, which are all now law. The ones that are now still in the Commons or the Lords are the Immigration Bill, the Agriculture Bill, the Fisheries Bill and, of course, the Financial Services Bill, as she's mentioned, and the Trade Bill is progressing through also. So that there is progress on these. They are all scheduled for when they need to receive royal assent. She asked for an update on secondary legislation, and I can say to her that almost all of the Brexit SIs that are needed for exit day have been laid, around 515 of about 550, and so those all of the programme for secondary legislation is in hand and it is almost completed, and the rest is all planned for completion as it needs to be. The honourable lady asks about schools, and I'm sure she'll want to celebrate, as I do, that there are now 1.9 million more children being taught in good and outstanding schools. and that we've created 920,000 more school places between 2010 and 2018. And very importantly, the gap between disadvantaged pupils and others has narrowed. All very important results for giving young people a good start in life. She asks for a statement on the knife crime summit. I will certainly take away that request, and I'm sure my right honourable friend, the Home Secretary, will want to update the House. She talked about the national living wage, and again, I'm sure she'll want to be sharing in the delight that the national living wage went up on Monday by the highest rate since it was first introduced in 2015, increasing by almost 5% to £8.21 per hour. The honourable gentleman shouts from a sedentary position. It was actually a Conservative government. In fact, it was the George Osborne, who was Chancellor at the time, who introduced the national living wage. This year, full-time... No, I'm talking about the national living wage. Full-time workers receiving the national living wage will be more than £2,750 better off a year compared to 2015. And then finally, the Honourable Lady raised the very serious issue of a photograph of the Leader of the Opposition being used as target practice. That is utterly unacceptable. I condemn it, as I'm sure do all Honourable and Right Honourable members, in the strongest terms. And I would add that it's vital that anybody who leads any kind of role in public life is extremely careful about the sort of images and portrayals that they put forward. And I understand that my Right Honourable friend, the Secretary of State, has written to the Shadow Secretary of State to respond to the point she's raised to him.
Brevity Czar himself. Sir Desmond Swain.
You missed it, Mr. Speaker, because your focus was properly on what was happening here. But the prolonged demonstration that took place in the gallery was a function of the fact that first the police had to be called, and second, frankly, they have a different way of operating and different priorities. Our doorkeepers are trained in the practice, but no longer carry it out because the House will not ensure them. Can we have a statement at how this is to be remedied next week?
The Leader of the House.
Well, my honourable friend is absolutely right to raise this matter, and I'm tempted to mention the bare cheek of it, Mr. Speaker, to have such a demonstration in the public gallery. It was certainly a very sticky matter that the police had to deal with, and I will be seeing, in fact, the Director General later today to talk about what more we can do.
Thank you. Pete Wishart.
Very much, Mr. Speaker, and can I thank the Leader of the House for announcing the business for what would have been the first week of our Easter recess. And we're giving up Easter recess for this. And I just hope we're going to see some more substantial business in the course of the next week, which will justify us giving up time being available for our constituents. And the thing is, Mr. Speaker, the Leader of the House has got absolutely no idea or clue what's going to be discussed and considered next week. And, Mr. Speaker, yesterday's innovation, I think, should be commended. And this House should be really proud that we delivered a piece of legislation within a few days that will underpin the seeking of an extension of Article 50. And there were those, of course, who, most curiously, amongst the take-back controllers, who didn't want this House to actually take back control. And we prefer the government to continue in its ways unfettered and continue to ignore decisions of this House. And it's taken legislation to get this minority government to do what the majority of this House wants it to do. Maybe now it knows that we can do this, it will start to take decisions in this House more seriously, but I seriously doubt that will be the case. This bill now goes to the House of Lords, and the great unelected ones will now consider this bill. And I think the message from this House to the aristocrats, to the Church of England bishops, to the cronies and the donors, is to do nothing that will thwart the progress of this bill. We're already seeing loads and loads of amendments being introduced down there, particularly from, curiously, some Scottish Conservative lords, and they must do absolutely nothing that will stop the will of this House getting through the democratic will of this Parliament. And can we have a debate, Mr. Speaker, about modern romance? Because I think there was a real Mills and Goon glow yesterday as the Leader of the Opposition sat down with the Prime Minister in order that she could share the blame for her Tory Brexit with him. He's gone from being, as the PM said last week, the biggest threat to our standing in the world, to our defence and to our economy, to the saviour of her Brexit. And we in Scotland are watching very carefully the reinvention of Better Together 2.0, Better Together the sequel, the latest in the Tory Labour disaster franchise. This time they together took Scotland out of the EU against its will. Scotland is sick of being ignored. The Scottish people are watching our nation being carved out and disrespected, and we won't sit idly by as the usual Better Together squad play their games with our nation in the European Union.
Leader of the House.
Well, the honourable gentleman will recognise that Better Together last time did quite well. So, you know, what the Prime Minister is seeking to do, as he will know, is to find a way to leave the European Union. And what is extraordinarily apparent, I think, to everybody is that so far the House has not agreed a way in which to leave the European Union. So it's right that the Prime Minister continues to seek the way to deliver on that referendum, and that's why she's talking to the Leader of the Opposition, as he well knows.
Dame Cheryl Gillen.
Speaker, could I ask the Leader of the House for a debate on budgeting and the transparency of public projects and their finances, particularly in the light of the delay to the notice to proceed on HS2 and the revelation that they are now spending millions of pounds on consultants tasked with trying to reduce or even control the mammoth costs of this project, all of which are going to be paid for by the taxpayer.
Well, my right honourable friend raises a very important issue, and she will be aware that many of my constituents also have concerns about the cost overruns, and I myself have written asking for reassurances on this point. The Department for Transport assures us that the project is still working to its budget, but I'm sure that my right honourable friend will continue to seek her own reassurances.
Mr. Ian Mearns.
Very grateful, Mr. Speaker. The demonstration in the public gallery has been referred to, Mr. Speaker, and I was kind of wondering if it was a possible manifestation of a modern-day rump parliament, but I wasn't. I do apologise. I'm here all week. We're
all here all week.
The Leader of the House has mentioned, though, that the business next week could be subject to rescheduling. And I genuinely offer a sort of hand of friendship and hope that if there is rescheduling, that there can be consultation with the clerk and myself in terms of the Backbench Business Committee to fill any gaps that might occur in the rescheduled business which has been moved from dates which has been presented on today. And I think the other thing, Mr. Speaker, is could we? I'm also a member of the Education Select Committee, Leader of the House, and I'm just wondering if we actually have a debate in government time about school funding, because the Institute for Fiscal Studies has shown that their figures show that the funding for schools in real terms is actually 8% lighter than it was several years ago. And the Minister of State for Schools was at the Education Select Committee on Wednesday and was suggesting that, like the DFID budget, it had been protected in real terms, but the DFID budget is 0.7% of GDP and has been protected at that, so it has grown in actual financial terms. But education funding has diminished from 5.69% of GDP to 4.27% of GDP in only 7 years. That is a real terms cut from the IFS and a real terms cut from the GDP perspective. We need to invest in our future if we are going to engage in and be successful in the fourth industrial revolution.
Well, I'm glad the honourable gentleman took pains to flesh out the matter of the protests a little further. I think we now need to crack on a bit with the business of the day. He offers to fill in any blanks in the business for next week, and of course, if there are opportunities for backbench business, we will always take them. And then he raises the very important matter of school funding. I mean, he will appreciate that some of the achievements in our schools, for which I pay great tribute to all of our teachers' professionalism, are incredibly positive for improving education for young people. But nevertheless, he does make an important point about funding, and I would encourage him to raise that directly with ministers on the 15th of April at Education Questions.
Thank you.
Sir David Amis.
Will my right honourable friend find time for a debate on the difficulties converts to Christianity are having in achieving asylum status in the United Kingdom? Whilst I'm sure the House understands that the Home Office has to be very careful, I simply don't understand their reluctance to approve these applications given all the checks and balances.
Well, my honourable friend raises an interesting point. What I can tell him is that all asylum claims made in the UK are carefully considered on a case-by-case basis, taking into account individual merits against a background of relevant case law and, of course, up-to-date country information, which covers issues relating to freedom of religion and belief. And I can also absolutely assure him that the Home Office provides protection for all those who genuinely need it, in accordance with our international obligations under the 1951 Refugee Convention and the European Convention on Human Rights.
Mr. Barry Chairman.
Mr. Speaker, can I point the leave the House to the real challenge that we have in our constituencies and in this place in the way we treat each other, the respect in which we, the language we use. Can we have a debate about that? And could she particularly bear in mind something that was very offensive that was said last night by the Member of Parliament for Rayleigh and Wickford, when at this time, as we are in Lent and approaching Easter weekend, when he used, "Forgive them, Father, for they do not what they do." That to a Christian, and I'm a former parliamentary church warden, it was deeply offensive to use that phrase in the context of a debate on Brexit. It was offensive, and I do hope that we can have a discussion about what is and what isn't appropriate to say in this House.
Leader of the
Well,
House.
as I have always said, it's vital that everybody in this place and in this Palace of Westminster treats each other with courtesy and respect, and I completely uphold that. As the honourable gentleman will be aware, the behaviour in the chamber is a matter for the chair, and on the other hand, I'm sure Mr. Speaker will also agree that it's vital everybody is treated with courtesy and respect.
Yes, that's absolutely fair and reasonable. I didn't intervene at the time, as the honourable gentleman will know. The right honourable gentleman felt extremely strongly, and he expressed himself with force, and I respect that right honourable member's sincerity and integrity. I make no bones about that, I do. But moderation in the use of language and the importance of trying to keep the temperature down can hardly be overstated. So I think that the honourable gentleman, the member for Huddersfield, has served a useful purpose today of which we can all take note. Sir Mike Penning.
Very much, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, you'll be aware that I go on and on about the lack of accountability with the NHS trusts in my constituency and around the country, and often when I raise this, there are lots of nods. So the Leader of the House has known that I've raised this before, and she suggested that I go to Westminster Hall debate. I've got that, so I'm back now, going on and on. Can we have a debate in government time of the lack of accountability of NHS trusts that seem to ignore not just politicians and their elected representatives, the people who actually they're supposed to be looking after?
Well, my right honourable friend is very passionate on this subject, and he's absolutely right to be. I think if he's exhausted all of his own means by which to achieve debates on this subject, then I would encourage him to perhaps go to the backbench committee and seek the support of other members across the House. I'm sure he'd find that there were plenty of members looking to support their own local hospitals.
John Cryer.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I heard the leader's answer on the Knife Crime Summit and subsequent events, but it really is unacceptable that the Home Secretary has not been here reporting on the Knife Crime Summit while our constituents, our young constituents, are regularly being murdered. When will he come here and give a report? And further to that, he really should be coming to this chamber on a regular basis and giving those reports.
Well, the honourable gentleman raises an incredibly serious issue, as he often does, about the appalling nature of the rise in knife crime and the impact it's having on communities and fear in communities. And there are far, far too many examples of young people being stabbed and murdered. It's absolutely appalling. He'll be aware that the Knife Crime Summit on Monday was designed to look at what more government can do. There are a huge number of plans in place. We've already had 2 debates recently on serious violence and what the government can do, as well as a number of urgent questions and statements on the subject. But I will certainly go away, as I said to his honourable friend, and see whether we can organise a statement on that same subject.
Mr. Peter Bone.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I hope you'll accept that I'm willing to call out the government on occasion when it abuses Parliament. I voted for the contempt motion. But I thought yesterday there was a conspiracy to defraud Parliament itself. On a huge constitutional issue, we rushed it through in a day. There was no time for proper debate. There wasn't even a third reading. The amendments weren't down. It was a total farce, and it was an abuse of Parliament. And it seems to me, sir, the solution to this, and it was something that both main political parties agreed to, was a business of the House Committee, which is responsible for the timing of debates. And the Backbench Business Committee has shown that it works really well. Leader, seriously, would the government now consider a business of the House Commission? And please, Leader, don't blow this off again.
Leader of the House.
The first part of my honourable friend's question I entirely endorse, and I would draw the House's attention to the fact that the Article 50 revocation bill contained 58 words, and it went through the entire Parliamentary Business and Legislation Committee process. It was consulted widely, and it had 5 days of debate in this chamber, compared to the under 1 hour of second reading for yesterday's bill. So I agree with him that it was extremely damaging to the way in which we carry out business in this place. To his second part, as I've said to him on a number of occasions, I don't believe that a business of the House Committee for determining business would have the necessary flexibility to be able to ensure that, as we're seeing at the moment, swift changes to business can be properly and reliably agreed. And from time to time, the House does need to go through usual channels with a very quick decision when emergency changes are necessary.
I don't want to dwell on what the honourable gentleman said at any length, and I completely respect his sincerity. I think it is fair just to note, reputationally for the House, that many of the members who are complaining about the paucity of time for the debate on the second reading of the bill did nevertheless seem untroubled by the absorption of 3 hours on the business of the House motion, and it was partly for that reason that there was so little time left for second reading. But there is an argument to be had about that matter, and I respect the honourable gentleman's point of view. I've heard what the leader has said about a business of the House Committee, and that is the government's position. The honourable gentleman has been a keen and articulate champion of the cause of such a committee for many years, and as he knows, I've joined him in that quest. It is a matter of recorded fact that the coalition government was committed to the introduction of such a committee, and Prime Minister Cameron, I say this as a matter of fact, reneged on that commitment. It is unarguable, it is incontestable, it is incontrovertible. That is the reality. He may think that the situation changed, but he promised it and he broke the promise. It's as simple as that. Paula Sheriff.
Mr. Speaker, last weekend proved to be the perfect tonic, and I was joined by over 75 members of my constituency for the Great British Spring Clean. Next week I'll be out again in Murfield supporting the indefatigable community champion Ruth Edwards with her Spring Clean. So I wondered if the Leader of the House would join me in welcoming the incredible work done by the likes of Ruth and others, and encourage all members to get involved in cleaning up their communities.
Well, the Honourable Lady is to be hugely commended for taking part in the Great British Spring Clean, and my PPS sat behind me, the Honourable Member for Banbury, who is a huge fan of this, is yelling in my ear, fantastic, fantastic, which I think all Honourable Members would agree. It's a superb thing to be involved in a community clean-up. It really does send a good message and cheers us all up to get outside as well. So I completely congratulate her and her constituent Ruth Edwards and all those who are taking part.
Will Quince.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Working parents of children with a disability or with a serious illness often have to take their entire holiday entitlement off for surgery or hospital appointments. Will the Leader of the House allow a debate in government time on what support the government can give to those working parents and how we can ensure that they get the quality holiday time that other working parents enjoy?
Well, my honourable friend raises a very important point. Of course, for parents, very often they have additional responsibilities to holding down a job, and particularly when they're caring for children with disabilities, it's absolutely vital that they get time, quality time, to spend with their families. I would encourage my honourable friend to perhaps seek an adjournment debate in the first instance so that he can discuss with ministers what more can be done.
Martin Whitfield.
Grateful, Mr. Speaker. Could we have a statement on the attitude that's taken, particularly from the Home Office, with regard to MPs telephoning them? I telephoned the hotline seeking some very urgent information and was given another telephone number. That was hung up on when I phoned them, and then when I phoned back later, they were unable to give me any information, and I'm careful about this regarding what I've asked. I've now emailed on 2 occasions and not received a response. The challenge is that my constituent is facing a deadline that's approaching. And without this information, I can't advise him and he can't take action.
Well, I'm genuinely very sorry to hear that, and I must say my own experience of the MP's hotline has been good with the Home Office, but I totally respect what the Honourable Gentleman's saying, that if he can't get through to the right people and they're not responsive, then that's absolutely unacceptable. I absolutely encourage him to take this up perhaps through a parliamentary written question, but if he wants to contact me, I can make contact with the Home Office on his behalf.
Greg Hands.
Could we get a bit more clarity on business the week after next? I think the Leader of the House said it's possible we'd be sitting on Monday and Tuesday, the 15th and 16th, but for the benefit of members and staff with Easter holiday, childcare problems to sort out, could she perhaps be a little bit more definitive as to what might happen or may not happen on Wednesday the 17th and Thursday the 18th?
So my right honourable friend is tempting me to get my crystal ball out, but I think, as all honourable members appreciate, I think we can all agree we need a break, and certainly the staff of the House do need a break, and we're very conscious of the need to try and ensure that people are able to meet prior commitments, as well as, for many colleagues, they have commitments in their constituencies that they need to fulfil. So there is no doubt I and the government are extremely well aware of the need for colleagues to have a break. On the other hand, as we all know, the business is changing very rapidly. We are extremely keen to ensure that we can leave the European Union with a deal, with a majority of the House supporting it, and in order to achieve that, it requires the next few days to be quite flexible. So I can only repeat that I will keep the House as updated as possible, but certainly at the moment I've said in my opening remarks that we need to retain flexibility to potentially sit on Monday and Tuesday the 15th and 16th of April during Holy Week, but I will update the House as soon as I possibly can.
Thank you. Jim Shannon.
Mr. Speaker, on Monday, April the 1st, the APPG for International Freedom of Religion and Belief, of which I have the privilege to chair, hosted a parliamentary briefing investigating the ongoing farmer-herder conflict in Nigeria. Nigeria is awash with weapons. This conflict has claimed tens of thousands of lives since the turn of the century. It is one of the bloodiest in the world at the moment, and as both groups happen to also be divided by religion, the farmers being mainly Christian, the herders being mainly Muslim, it threatens to escalate into a full-blown religious war. Will the Leader of the House agree to a statement or debate on this very, very pressing matter? Thank you.
Leader of the House.
Well, I'm grateful to the honourable gentleman for his question. The government is concerned by the recurrent clashes involving pastoralists and local farmers, and we continue to call for an immediate de-escalation of violence and for the Nigerian government to demonstrate a clear strategy for resolving the conflict, ending the violence and ensuring the needs of all of the communities are taken into account. There's no doubt that these clashes have a devastating impact on lives and communities, as well as, of course, being a major barrier to Nigeria's economic development.
John Lamont.
Thank you very much, Mr Speaker. I'm very pleased that this government is investing £290 million in investing in the A1 road north of Newcastle to Berwick-upon-Tweed. Sadly, north of the border, 17 miles of the A1 still remains a single-track road. Now, transport policy is devolved to the Scottish Parliament, and yet the Scottish Government is refusing to take any action to improve this important cross-border route. So could we have a debate about how both governments, the UK Government and the Scottish Government, could work together to improve cross-border connectivity?
Well, as always, my honourable friend raises an important issue on behalf of his constituents and many others. He's right that under the devolution settlement, roads within Scotland are the responsibility of the Scottish Government, and it is for them to prioritise and fund any relevant schemes. I hope they will take the decision to do so. For our part, UK Government ministers and officials regularly collaborate with their counterparts in Scotland on issues of mutual interest, including cross-border connections, and they have previously discussed the dualling of the A1.
Vicky Foxcroft.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. I wonder if the Leader of the House can provide us with a date when the Timpson's review into exclusions will be produced. And if she can't provide a date of when, perhaps she could explain why. Why have we had a delay since December last year?
Leader of the House.
Well, I'm grateful to the honourable lady for her question, and as I've said to her, she's raised this on a number of occasions, and as I've said to her, I have chased for a date on which this report will be published. She's absolutely right to keep pursuing it, and I am continuing to seek to get an answer for her. She's asking why from a sedentary position, and as I've tried to explain previously, the review is considering the difference in exclusion rates between different areas and why that's taking place, and that therefore makes the review quite complicated and time-consuming.
Martin Vickers.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. The Leader of the House will recall that 3 weeks ago I raised with her the question of the accountability of Network Rail. And this is particularly relating to their proposed closure of Suggett's lane level crossing in my constituency. But the accountability issue has become more serious because the Grimsby Telegraph is reporting that when contractors moved in to lock the gates, they hauled away cars parked near to the crossing. Surely, Mr Speaker, Network Rail should not have the powers to haul away private vehicles. Could we have a statement from the Department of Transport on this issue?
Leader of the House.
Well, my honourable friend's concerns sound very justified. Of course, the safety of our railways is paramount, but as he knows, it is a matter for Network Rail working with the independent regulator, which is the Office of Rail and Road. I can tell him, however, that I understand that an urgent meeting on the Suggett's lane level crossing closure has been arranged for Monday with the Rail Minister, senior representatives from Network Rail and with my honourable friend himself, so I do hope that there'll be some progress as a result of that.
And Mrs Madeline Moon.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. I thank the Shadow Leader of the House for reminding the House that it is the 70th anniversary of the signing of the Washington Treaty. Can I also remind the House that London was the first home of the NATO alliance, and that actually the first shots fired by NATO was during a peacekeeping mission in Bosnia in 1996. If the Leader of the House is short of business for next week, can I suggest we could celebrate the NATO alliance, which has kept peace and security across Europe and North America for 70 years.
Leader of the House.
Well, the Right Honourable Lady is absolutely right to pay tribute to the amazing achievements of NATO, which has been the cornerstone of our defence for 70 years, as she rightly points out. I certainly will take away her request for a debate in government time and see what can be done.
Mark Pawsey.
Mr Speaker. There's a sense of anticipation in rugby because the finalists of the Pride of Rugby Awards have been announced. They're run superbly by our local radio station, Rugby FM, and recognise local achievers in business, charities and amongst our volunteers and our young people. At a time when we hear a lot of challenges that communities face, can we have a debate to recognise some of the great work that's going on within our communities?
Well, Mr Speaker, I think it's always very welcome that Business Question is a chance for colleagues to praise the excellent work that goes on in their communities. And I do congratulate my honourable friend and join him in congratulating the finalists of the Pride of Rugby Awards. I do wish them all the best for the event. The UK is undoubtedly a very generous place. It's something we should all celebrate. I understand that the British public donated £10.3 billion to all causes in 2017. Which cements the UK's place as one of the most generous nations in the world, something we can all celebrate.
Chris Stevens.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. Given the success and the viewing figures of BBC Parliament in the last few weeks, can the Leader of the House tell us if there's any plans to broadcast Cabinet meetings live? Given that the details of these meetings are leaked within minutes, shouldn't we just cut out the middleman? And can the Leader of the House tell us what's true? Is there more infighting in the Cabinet meeting, or will there be in the next episode of Game of Thrones?
Leader of the House.
Well, what I can say to the honourable gentleman is that it's not a great TV show what goes on in Cabinet, because it's too often not correct what gets reported. So you know, it either has to be a documentary or it's a fabrication. And sometimes I sit in Cabinet and hear one thing and then read it in the newspapers and it wasn't the same at all. So it's someone's interpretation. But anyway, I mean, the honourable gentleman makes a very serious point about the way in which Cabinet commentary does get out into the press, and there are interpretations on all manner of meetings that take place. And I think what it really says to me, and what I always urge young people when I go into universities and schools to talk to them about democracy, is don't believe everything you read. It's definitely not always true. You do need to go to the source.
John Howell.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. I recently launched the new Saturday bus service in Henley. Can we have a debate on buses to show how smaller, more local buses can help?
The House.
Well, congratulations to my honourable friend. I think there'll be a number of honourable members who would love to be doing the same in their areas. He will be aware that the bus market outside London is deregulated, and that decisions regarding service provision is primarily a commercial matter for bus operators. And individual English local authorities will make decisions on whether or not to subsidise bus services. The Bus Services Act of 2017 does provide the tools local authorities need to improve local bus services and increase passenger numbers, but I'm sure I wouldn't be alone in this place thinking that we need to do more to provide better bus transportation for all of our communities.
Paul Sweeney.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. We had a debate on the urgent need to fund community-based projects to tackle climate change. North Glasgow Housing Association is the biggest community-owned housing association in Glasgow, my constituency, and also Lamb Hill Stables, been doing fantastic work using climate challenge funding from the Scottish Government, including community swap shops, furniture, educating young people using comics, even some fantastic stuff in all sorts of different fields. But unfortunately that funding has now been not renewed for this year, so they're now not able to continue with those projects. So we're going to have an urgent debate about the urgent need to advance funding for these sorts of community-based climate change initiatives.
Leader of the House.
Well, first, can I congratulate his constituents for their work on this? It's incredibly important that we do all we can to make people aware of the importance of climate change and the steps that we can take to address it. He'll be aware that our 25-year environment plan seeks to ensure that we're the first generation that leaves our environment in a better place than we found it. And within that plan, there are lots of different initiatives, and I would encourage him to perhaps talk to ministers in DEFRA about what more they can do to support initiatives like the ones he mentions.
Luke Graham.
Thank you very much, Mr Speaker. Mr Speaker, earlier it was mentioned it's cherry blossom time, and can I encourage every member of the House to come and see the Japanese garden in Clackmannanshire, my constituency, where I recently joined the Japanese Consul General to actually plant new cherry blossoms, which hopefully everyone can enjoy in the near future. Can I ask the Leader for some debate time on actual rural development? We spend a lot of time talking about our towns and cities, but our rural communities are working very hard to improve prosperity and employment through schemes schemes such as the Can Do Creef Shared Workspace that was recently established in my constituency. So can we have some more debate time to rural issues, because country is just as important as town?
Leader of the House.
Well, I completely agree with my honourable friend that the countryside is every bit as important as the towns, and we need to do everything possible to ensure that our rural communities are thriving. We do have housing communities and local government questions on Monday, and I would encourage him to raise with ministers what more can be done to support rural communities.
Colleen Fletcher.
Thank you. The Duke of Edinburgh's Volunteering Achievement Award has been presented to pupils in Coventry to celebrate 9,360 hours of voluntary services by the city's young people. Oh, that's over the last 12 months. We know that volunteering efforts like these help young people to develop, build confidence and gain important life skills, while also improving the health and well-being of the local community around them. Will the Leader of the House join me in commending Coventry's young volunteers, and will she arrange a debate in government time on the importance of volunteering and how it can help inspire a generation of young people who care about where they live and who are willing to make a commitment to improve society?
The House.
Well, the Honourable Lady always speaks up for Coventry, and she's quite right to do so, and I definitely join with her in congratulating all those young people. I think she said 9,360 hours in the last 12 months of volunteering. That's a superb record, something they can be very proud of.
Ellen Coker.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Can the leader tell me where the Home Secretary is? I asked last week whether he was going to come and make a statement, and the leader said she was going to go and speak to him. We have a knife crime summit. Nobody's got a clue what happened there. He's not bothered to come to the House of Commons and explain it. We read in the papers about search powers being changed. Not a word to this House of Commons about it. We read about extra money to all sorts of groups. Not a word to this House of Commons about it. I'll tell you something, can the leader again go to the Home Secretary, tell him to get over here and start making some statements to this House of Commons about the national emergency of knife crime which faces this country?
Leader.
Well, the honourable gentleman, I know, cares passionately about this issue, as do many honourable and right honourable members who raise this frequently at business questions. As a matter of fact, my right honourable friend, the Secretary of State for the Home Office, was here yesterday with a statement on Windrush compensation. So he is, of course, always willing and keen to update this House as soon as there is something important, some important breakthrough. The honourable gentleman will know that there has been a tremendous amount of work gone into our serious violence strategy, that's gone into the offensive weapons bill, into creating knife crime prevention orders, into the youth endowment fund, and into the recent discussions on making it a public health matter to try to ensure that we do everything possible to steer young people away from a life of knife crime and violence. So I totally understand the honourable gentleman's frustration. I will again raise this issue with the Home Secretary, but he is very willing and has indeed come to this House very regularly to update the House whenever there is more to say.
Nick Dakin.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. At his last meeting with the Steel All-Party Group, the Steel Minister, the Honourable Member for Watford, committed to bring together all the key stakeholders in steel to look again at how to progress a steel sector deal. Can we have a statement from the Secretary of State for Business, Energy and Industrial Strategy on how we're going to bring about this steel summit?
I wasn't aware of that commitment that was made, but I would say to the honourable gentleman, if he wants to write to me afterwards, then I can take it up with the department on his behalf.
Diana Johnson.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. On my way into Westminster, I walk through the Canary Wharf Crossrail station most mornings. It's a pristine station. It cost £500 million and it was opened in 2015. And there won't be any trains using that station, I think, until at least 2020. It's a bit like the Yes Minister hospital, if the leader remembers, where there were no patients, but it was seen to be a very efficient hospital. The Public Accounts Committee have said that the cost of Crossrail has spiralled out of control, over £18 billion so far and counting, and there are question marks remaining over its completion. Now in Hull, in the station, the railway station in Hull, we can't get new signage or the toilets sorted out. let alone electrification of the line. So can we please have a debate on investment in rail in the north and not just in London?
Minister.
Well, I'm very sympathetic to the Honourable Lady's desire to see more investment in the north. She will be aware that the government is investing significant sums in new rail infrastructure and in improving the experience of all train users. With regards to Crossrail itself, what I can tell her is that it is now working to deliver a revised schedule for the project, and that the Department for Transport are working closely with the IPA and the National Accounts Office, National Audit Office, to ensure that lessons are learned for the delivery of major projects. But once built, this new Crossrail line will provide up to a £42 billion boost to the UK economy and will enable 200 million journeys across London and the South East. But I absolutely understand the Honourable Lady wants to see more investment in the north, and that is also happening. It's not either or, but both.
Matt Weston.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The last fortnight, up and down the country, households have received their council tax bills, and members will be well aware that they've seen significant increases, almost twice the rate of inflation and twice pay increases. In my own constituency, 5% increase on council tax, 12% on the police levy, and residents are very concerned they're receiving less for paying more. In that backdrop, I have a local authority that wishes to build themselves a new council office. I wanted to ask the leader if we could actually have a debate on what I thought was a terrific programme, which was the One Public Estate, introduced in 2013, to examine where we are with those sorts of programmes.
Well, the Honourable Gentleman raises the issue of council tax rises, and he will be aware that in real terms council taxes have fallen since 2010 under the Conservative and Coalition government, and that's been very important, is to hold down those increases. But at the same time during this week, I'm sure he will want to celebrate that there's over 1.3 billion extra available for local councils, over £1 billion extra for our schools, and of course, really importantly, a rise in the national living wage, giving a full-time worker a £2,750 annual pay rise since its introduction, as well as another rise in the personal tax-free allowance, leaving a basic rate taxpayer over £1,200 better off a year than in 2010. So I totally sympathise with the Honourable Gentleman's point about council taxes rising, but the other side of the economy, the government is taking steps to ensure that there are better services, that people get to keep more of their hard-earned income, and that people in our economy are better off through job increases, wage increases and increases in their personal tax-free allowance.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Some of my constituents have received letters this week informing them that the owner of their home, the freeholder, has changed from one company based in Guernsey to another company based in Guernsey. Now, we've had a very powerful Select Committee report. We've had various vacuous pledges about what's going to be done to tackle leasehold abuses, but the fact remains that these kind of manoeuvres are making it harder and more expensive for my constituents to actually purchase the freehold of their property outright. So can we have a statement, please, from government about what they're going to do to protect existing leaseholders?
Well, I certainly share the Honourable Gentleman's concern about the way in which some properties are being sold as leases, and then those who've bought them are being charged additional sums on an increasing basis. That cannot be right. We do have housing, communities and local government questions on Monday. I would encourage him to raise it there.
Order. Statement. The Minister of State for Asia and the Pacific, Minister Mark Field.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. If I may, I should like to make a statement about Brunei and Sharia law. Now, Mr. Speaker, I appreciate this is an issue that has been of widespread concern in the House and was subject twice to urgent questions earlier in the week by the Honourable Lady for Edinburgh West. And if I may slightly apologise, obviously slightly fewer members, I suspect, here in the House today than we might have had, given how late we sat last night, and an understandable desire for many to head off. But I thought it was worth making a full statement on this particular issue. And it was no criticism of you, Mr. Speaker, that you didn't allow the urgent questions, not least because we were able to touch on this issue in the slightly unsatisfactory way that one does during Foreign and Commonwealth questions. Let me just say this. Brunei introduced Sharia criminal law in 2014 to operate alongside the common law system in that country. The implementation of the final phases of the associated Sharia penal code was delayed from 2014 until yesterday. These final phases now introduce the possibility of Haddad corporal and capital punishments, which may include amputation for theft and execution by stoning for witnessed adultery and anal sex. The Sharia penal code requires 4 witnesses or a confession from the offender in order for any conviction to be secured. It is therefore a fairly tall ask. However, this does not, of course, mean that it is impossible to achieve. Now, under the common law in Brunei, homosexuality is already a criminal offence. Whippings are also quite frequently used as a punishment for a variety of offences, and the death penalty remains on the statute book, although it has not been enforced at all since 1992. I want to be absolutely clear about the UK's position on this. This government considers it appalling that in the 21st century, people anywhere are still facing potential persecution and discrimination because of who they are and whom they love. We strongly support and defend the rights of the LGBT+ community here in the UK and all around the world. We're also absolutely oppose the death penalty in all circumstances and in all its forms, and nor do we believe that the amputation or stoning are legitimate or acceptable punishments. Indeed, we would consider them to be illegal under international human rights laws that relate to torture and to cruel, inhuman or degrading treatment. We also note that since the introduction of Sharia criminal law in Brunei in 2014, the vast majority of crimes have continued to be brought to justice under the existing common law system, which, as I say, runs in parallel in that country. However, if implemented, we believe these extreme Haddad punishments would contravene Brunei's international commitments to respect human rights and individual freedoms. That is why we have expressed very deep concerns to the government of Brunei. I personally raised this matter when I was in that country in August with His Majesty the Sultan, the Minister of Religious Affairs, and the Foreign Minister, Dato' Arian, when I visited that country, as I say, some 7-8 months ago. Last week, I wrote to Dato' Arian to re-emphasise our concern about the use of Haddad punishments, which would contravene the international standards and values the UK and Brunei both uphold. Earlier this week, our outstanding High Commissioner, Richard Lindsay, also raised these concerns with senior Bruneian ministers, including the Ministers of Foreign Affairs, Religious Affairs and Finance. He received assurances that common law would continue to be the primary means of administering justice, and that the burden of proof under the Sharia penal code had been set to be almost unattainably high. And obviously, we welcome this. However, I understand that the Foreign Secretary will speak with his counterpart, the Bruneian Foreign Minister, later today, and will urge the government of Brunei to take further steps to ensure that these extreme punishments cannot be used, and also to respect the rights and freedoms of all their citizens. Now, colleagues throughout the House may be concerned by the potential impact of Sharia criminal law in Brunei on British nationals, for whom, of course, we have specific consular responsibility. I should like to take this opportunity to assure the House that our travel advice has been updated to ensure that all British citizens are aware of the introduction of the new laws under the Sharia penal code. Supporting British nationals, of course, remains our #1 priority, and we shall continue to provide consular support for all British folk in Brunei, should it be required. Many members will also be aware we have, in addition, some specific responsibilities towards British military personnel and their families who are stationed in Brunei, including as part of our long-standing garrison agreement, which dates back to the existence of Brunei as an independent state in 1962. Again, I can assure the House that we have the necessary protections in place with the government of Brunei. Madam Deputy Speaker, if I may just conclude with this. We have a close friendship for historical and indeed for ongoing reasons with Brunei. And I have to say, from my own experience, not just going out to Brunei, but with Bruneians here in this country, they regard themselves with good cause as a generous, friendly and tolerant people. And they are very worried to see the tarnishing of their own reputation given the press that has been in the recent days, not just here in the UK, I hasten to add, but actually across the world. But we also have an important relationship with Brunei, with our bilateral security, of which the garrison is one part. But this has, and never has, prevented us from raising very difficult issues, sometimes with them. On the contrary, I believe that the strength and the richness of that relationship permits us to share our views and to express those concerns, sometimes openly, sometimes more in private, but always frankly, and we seek to work together to address these issues. This government, and I know I'm fairly sure I speak for the entire House, but this government, our High Commissioner and I will continue to urge the government of Brunei to take all the steps to reassure their own people, the United Kingdom, and of course the wider international community that they are fully committed to allowing all citizens and residents of Brunei to live with dignity, free from violence, discrimination or persecution. Moreover, as an integral part of our foreign policy work around the world, we shall continue to oppose the use of the death penalty in all circumstances and to promote the rights of LGBT+ people. No one should face punishment for whom they are or whom they love. I commend this statement to the House.
Shadow Minister Khalid Mahmood.
Thank you very much, Madam Deputy Speaker. And can I thank the Minister for advance sight of his statement. Can I thank him as well for the concern and care that he has brought to this issue, and as he has done on other issues, including Kashmir and the Rohingya, and many other issues in his brief. In light of that, I would just say that my right honourable friend, the Shadow Foreign Secretary, talked the other day about his former friend, the member for North East Bedfordshire, and said that we would miss him, both in substance and the tone that he brought to our debates. But I believe that the Minister of State today brings the same substance to our debates, and he could be also said that he knows how to set the tone for his department. And I think that we've seen that again today. Madam Deputy Speaker, what we've seen in Brunei in the past week with these proposed new laws has been shocking and shameful, but has also been deeply sad. I want to read a few words, one of the members of staff in our Shadow Foreign Office team, an English young woman who grew up in Brunei. She said this when she heard the news: "It breaks my heart that a country I would credit with opening my mind and my heart, my formative years, and deeply embedding me a love of the world and the people in it, could now preach such utter hatred against just because of the people they love." And that is absolutely right, Madam Deputy Speaker. Brunei is a beautiful country. It's a warm and welcoming people. It has for a long time been a diversity of races and nationalities. For them to take such backward step, a step back into the darkness, with these horrific proposals for people to be stoned and whipped to death just because of their sexuality, is truly heartbreaking and fundamentally evil. But, Madam Deputy Speaker, it is also a clear breach of Brunei's obligations under the Commonwealth Charter in respect of human rights, and there are surely must be immediate consequences for Brunei if they press ahead with these proposals in terms of membership of the Commonwealth. Because for far too long, Madam Deputy Speaker, the Commonwealth has stood for human rights when it comes to democratic abuses in countries like Nigeria, Zimbabwe, Gambia, but it has turned a blind eye when it comes to LGBT discrimination. That we see in Asia, Africa and the Caribbean. But, Madam Deputy Speaker, it is time for the Commonwealth to draw a line in the sand on LGBT rights, and that must be drawn now when it comes to Brunei, because we cannot, in a situation where a Commonwealth country announces plans to stone, whip LGBT people to death, and the Commonwealth does nothing. So I thank the Minister of State for his words, and I hope those words would lead to action. And whether that means suspending our support for Brunei's armed forces or other measures we can take, I hope all that will include the action that he has stated, calling for an immediate meeting of the Commonwealth Ministerial Action Group and agreeing that if Brunei does not drop its proposals, they will, with great regret, be a matter of urgency but be suspended from the Commonwealth. Thank you.
May I thank the honourable gentleman for his kind words, but also, again, his tone. And I think it's very important at a time when so many debates in this House have been very fractious on matters that we dare not discuss, but more importantly, that we are able to unite and, in a constructive way, talk about an issue that I know is close to the hearts of many of us in this House. On the issue of the garrison, I've touched on it. The importance of security within the region is something that we do take very seriously, and I think we are obviously negotiating a range of safeguards for British nationals. But I think the main thrust of what the honourable gentleman had to say was to do with the Commonwealth, and I wanted to touch on that if I may. As he alluded to, the Commonwealth Charter states very specifically that members are opposed to all forms of discrimination, whether rooted in gender, race, colour, creed, political belief or other grounds. And at the Commonwealth Heads of Government meeting here in London in April of last year, the Prime Minister made absolutely clear that no one should face persecution or discrimination because of who they are, who they love, and the UK stands ready to support any Commonwealth member wanting to reform outdated legislation that makes such discrimination possible. I think I should put this into context. This is not in any way to justify what is happening specifically in relation to Brunei, but it is worth, I think, recognising that in relation to the death penalty, 30 member states of the Commonwealth do have the death penalty, 4 have imposed a full or partial moratorium, 19 have abolished it, and obviously we're working on trying to increase that number. As regards the criminalisation of same-sex relationships, there are still 35 member states that still criminalise consensual same-sex relations, primarily as a result of colonial-era legislation. That doesn't actually apply in relation to Brunei, obviously. But since CHOGM 2018, 2 Commonwealth member states have decriminalised same-sex relationships, India and Trinidad and Tobago, and together they account for, of course, well over 1 billion people. And I think what I wanted to say is that obviously there are also 2 member states that are able to impose death penalty, in principle at least, for same-sex relationships. Brunei and some 12 states in the north of Nigeria, which have adopted elements of Sharia law. Through a component of their legal system, this of course does not mean the death penalty will necessarily be enacted. Now, clearly this is an issue that we are working with Commonwealth countries, have been working and will continue to do so. We would like to think there is progress being made. Obviously, I would very much agree with the sentiment of the House that the imposition of a Sharia code in this way the penal code aspect of it is a backward step as far as Brunei is concerned. But I think there is progress elsewhere, and we will continue to work within the broad international community as well as within the Commonwealth to try and ensure that countries come on board. I think the best way of doing it, rather than making threats about kicking out countries, expelling them from the Commonwealth, are more positive ways to try and hold them close, recognise that there are some very strong connections that are there. And I think I would go back again at the very individual level to what the honourable gentleman said, that a close member of his Foreign Commonwealth team staff, for whom it bleeds their heart, it is giving a very misleading impression of actually what a friendly and generous place Brunei is. It is, and indeed the Sultan of Brunei has been a great friend of this country over many years. He has himself, I think, become a little more devout as he has got older in life, and it's one of the reasons that the Sharia code, based of course on Saudi Arabian Sharia code, has been put into place. But I'm very hopeful that we can continue to have a positive and constructive dialogue on this issue in both Brunei and, as I say, with a number of other countries whom we would like to see making changes in future.
Tom Tugendhat.
Madam Deputy Speaker, looking around this chamber, I'm reminded of some of the transformations that we've seen over generations and that have now become so normal and so obviously the right decision, and I think particularly of the freedom of women to have a say in our public life and in our private life. One of the things that we have not yet seen is the normalisation of the equality of love. We don't see it totally in the United Kingdom in cultural senses, and we don't see it around the world in areas where we should. And this is something that we're talking about today because it is a friend of the United Kingdom who has decided to turn in the wrong direction. I've heard what my right honourable friend, the Minister, has said, and I encourage very strongly the words that he has been using, but if I could urge him not just to press harder directly, but actually also to use the regional approach that he has been so successfully deploying in many other circumstances, to talk to our partners and our friends in other countries in the area, to make sure that the government in Brunei, country which we feel very warmly towards, and as he knows more than anybody, has a battalion of Gurkhas who do an enormous amount of work in defending the monarchy and defending the people there. This really is a moment when Brunei really could step forward, change its mind, and become again a bastion for peace, and in this case, an expression of equality and tolerance that it has been in so many other areas.
Thank you, Mayor. I thank my honourable friend, who of course knows this area of the world well. Listen, they're very wise words. There's very little I can add to them, and I think all of us feel that in Brunei, for those who haven't visited, it is a very beautiful country, and it is, I'd say, a regret that this penal code has come onto the statute book. As I say, I'm fairly confident that actually, because of the high bar for proof, but also the fact that they have a common law stream of law that is in place, that in many ways little will happen in this regard. I think it is one of the reasons there has been such surprise in Brunei at the international abhorrence that has been expressed. But as I say, we will do our level best, remembering, as I say, that Brunei are and have been strong friends, and we want to try and encourage them to protect and promote values that I hope will become universal.
Martin Doherty-Hughes.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. Can I first of all thank the Minister for early sight of the statement, and thank him and the Shadow Minister for their robust enunciation of the tactics now being taken by the Sultan and also by, I suppose, in some way by the government of Brunei in terms of the Sharia law and its implementation for a range of issues. And not just for LGBT issues. I've got to admit, as a gay man, it comes as no surprise to me that we live in a world in which members of my own identity are still either stoned, hung, murdered, clearly because of their having sex with someone of the same gender, and also for lesbian women who are to be stoned, to be whipped. But it's not just about LGBT issues. We have the amputation laws, in which is directed also at children who could be amputated. We need to be very much aware of this. I wonder if maybe the Minister will say something about that. We also have a range of issues around religious freedom, or the reduction of religious freedom in Brunei. So I think it would be beholden, it could not beholden me to stand here and say we cannot take some more robust action, for especially in terms of the Commonwealth. And I know that the Shadow Minister did mention the Commonwealth, and the idea we're now into a moment where we have Commonwealth 2.0 rhetoric deployed by many in this place, it should also not be missed. I think we also need to be clear that Brunei is just one of 35 states, Madam Deputy Speaker, within the Commonwealth where being either lesbian, gay, bisexual or transgender is illegal. Indeed, those states which do not criminalise their LGBT citizens are in the profound minority. And I'm sure it would come as no surprise, with having the largest LGBT number of members in their own political group in this place, that the Scottish National Party will be unbending in our support for the fundamental human rights as enshrined as we are at the moment as a member of the European Union, the European institutions. But let's be clear, Madam Deputy Speaker, while there are many in this chamber who may seek to return to days of laissez-faire economics and mercantilism as some sort of liberation, those of us on these benches will be looking very carefully at how the government deals with this through the institutions of the Commonwealth, which it claims great influence. And so I'd like to maybe then just ask the Minister for some direct questions. Can the government ensure it registers its strongest objections through the Secretary-General of the Commonwealth, that it considers asking for suspension in line with the suspension of Zimbabwe, as was mentioned by the Minister of the Opposition Shadow Minister, not expulsion but suspension until it gets its act together, and finally protect the rights of members of the armed forces who should not have to go, if they're members of the LGBT community, should not have to go to a place like Brunei, putting themselves at direct danger.
Here. Thank the honourable gentleman for his words. Clearly we will take this matter up with the Secretary-General of the Commonwealth. Let me just say a little bit, if I may, about the broader Commonwealth position on LGBT rights, given the context that we both discussed, that over half the members of the Commonwealth have on the statute book, at least, what we would regard as discriminatory legislation. Using UK funding, the Equality and Justice Alliance is working to create a fairer, more equal and more inclusive Commonwealth for the LGBT community and more broadly actually for women and for girls. The project is creating a cross-Commonwealth network and of high-level champions and offering technical assistance for reform of laws that discriminate against or fail to protect women, girls and LGBT individuals. We will also do this through the Commonwealth Ministerial Action Group, currently being chaired by Kenya, but we are members, as the Honourable Gentleman will be aware, by virtue of our being the chair in office. The chairmanship of the Commonwealth came through us, as I say, last April. That, I think, provides a space for some of these very sensitive discussions, which in turn will allow, I hope, for very discreet engagement, including, of course, through the good offices of the Secretary-General.
Crispin Blunt.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. Obviously, the Minister will recall me raising this at Foreign Office questions on Tuesday. But what struck me in his reply to my topical question then and now is the utter paucity of any proposed government action. And I wonder if the Minister could give an explanation to the House. First, when were we aware that this proposal was coming down the track? And it is not just about LGBT citizens. A third of the Bruneian population are not Muslim. And plainly, the whole problem of death for apostasy presents a significant threat to anyone who is then going to profess a new belief in a society where lots of different belief systems are present. The barbaric matters have been referred to about amputation and the death penalty for adultery. And I don't take any comfort from my honourable friend referring to the requirement of the number of witnesses for these crimes, as confessions are obtained rather more easily in these circumstances. So this is an utter affront. We've known it's coming. Why haven't we diverted them? Can he explain that? And exactly what are we going to do to make sure that Brunei pays a price that can at least be paid, which it won't be with membership of the Commonwealth, with two-thirds of the Commonwealth states still having anti-LGBT laws on the statute books?
I thank my honourable friend from Reigate. The Sharia criminal law came into being in 2014, and at that point, and certainly when I was in the country, as I say, last summer, we were well aware that we were heading towards a path where the Sharia penal code would come into play, and made those warnings. So the warnings that we have tried to give to the Bruneian authorities go back, certainly in my time as a minister, and possibly for some time before that. As I would reiterate, the new Sharia penal code does not supplant the existing common law, which will apply in most cases, and I think will apply obviously to non-Muslims within that country. The burden of proof for conviction under Sharia is incredibly high, and there will be no new intrusive efforts at enforcement. But I do understand the frustrations that my honourable friend has put into play. I mean, I can only say through the diplomatic network we have tried to warn, and I mean, it probably has come as a surprise, as I say, to many in Brunei, just the international outcry that this imposition of a penal code has put into play. We will continue to make those representations diplomatically. As I say, I personally take a view that it would be better to try to keep that country within the Commonwealth and to make the changes and the sort of changes that with some of the initiatives that we have in play, rather than putting threats of expulsion into play. But I'm sorry that my honourable friend, who I know is quite robust on these and indeed many other matters, feels that we have been light and lily-livered on this. I can only reassure him, certainly in my time as a minister, we have been aware of the concerns coming down the track and have done our level best to try and advise the Brunei accordingly.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. I mean, it's important to note, as well as the other so-called and obviously not crimes that have been mentioned, this Sharia law, as I understand it, also prohibits women from having abortions, punishable again by violent punishments, and that's surely a health matter, and adultery, which is surely a private matter. Now, the Article 1 of the Convention Against Torture prohibits the use of intentionally inflicted pain as a form of punishment inflicted by a state actor. Brunei is a signatory but has not implemented this, but we have implemented that convention, and we're bound by Article 3 with the principle of refoulement, which means that we should not be returning, expelling or extraditing to another country anyone for whom there is substantial grounds that they will be in danger of that torture or cruel punishment if returned. So can I ask the Minister if he can tell me what discussions he's having with counterparts in other government departments about ensuring that we are abiding by that principle of Article 3?
Honourable lady, and I know she's got a debate next week in Westminster Hall, so I'll maybe have a second bite of the cherry if I don't get it right this time round in discussing some of these technical issues. Clearly, it is an issue that at the moment has been dealt with through the Foreign Office network rather than through other government departments, but it is something clearly, given the international obligations that the UK has, that will need to be discussed beyond that, particularly obviously with the Ministry of Defence, given the number of UK citizens, they are Gurkhas and UK citizens who are there in garrison.
Philip Hollowbone.
ISIS push gay people off buildings, and now Brunei are threatening to stone gay people to death. Will the United Kingdom take the lead in the Commonwealth in making it clear that such punishments are simply incompatible with Commonwealth membership?
Well, I thank my honourable friend. As I mentioned, the Prime Minister could not have made it more clear in London last April at the Heads of Government meeting where we stood on these issues. As I have also said, we have tried to work in a constructive way to ensure that where there is out-of-date legislation, some of it actually, of course, legislation from the colonial era, that there are changes made. Clearly there has been some progress, perhaps not as quick as some members would like. I believe possibly trying to utilise the carrot rather than the stick might be the right approach at this stage.
Christine Jardine.
Thank you very much. Can I thank the Minister for prior side of his statement, and also welcome the tone he has taken about this recognising the inhumanity that we see in these laws. But I'm also disappointed that he's willing to accept that the bar may be set high for convictions and that might be acceptable. The fact of the law, the threat of the law to people who are LGBT or young people who might be coping with recognising their own sexuality is surely unacceptable. And can I, further to the comments already made by honourable members, plead that he tries to take action through the Commonwealth, because we should never forget that it was not international outcry which defeated apartheid. It was action, and perhaps action is what we need here now.
May I thank the Honourable Lady. I'm not sure she was actually in the chamber the very second when I praised her. I know she's tried twice to get a UQ, and I thought rather than having the Speaker disappointing her on a third occasion, we would come forward with a statement. Thank you for her kind words, but also I accept that there needs to be action on this matter as well. And I'm not trying to belittle the seriousness of the situation, but just try to put into context the likelihood of any of these punishments actually being carried out. It's a Sharia penal code that has been put into play. But she makes, I think, a perfectly strong point. We will try and work closely with the Commonwealth. And I guess the comparative to, as she said, with apartheid, I'm not saying that we should be anything other than have a sense of urgency. Equally, sometimes in international affairs, as we know, there has to be patience. And one looks at the transformation in this country. We're not entirely all the way there, but the transformation in LGBT rights in this country, even in my adulthood and over the past 30 years. Whilst I understand the frustrations that many have who want to see all these things achieved immediately, equally, sometimes we have to be patient, move in the right direction. And I believe we are in a position to do that, but I will make sure that the Commonwealth Secretary-General is made well aware of the concerns addressed in the House today.
Yes.
Richard Graham.
Madam Deputy Speaker, the reason I suggest why this House cares so much about the introduction of the Sharia penal code in Brunei is partly because the Kingdom of Brunei is a long-standing ally and Commonwealth partner. and therefore this is a great disappointment to us all. But partly because Brunei becomes the first country in East or Southeast Asia to introduce the Sharia penal code. And while the trend of the Commonwealth and the world in general is to liberalise, indeed that's what the Commonwealth Charter counts on all members to do, this is a step in the opposite direction. Would my right honourable friend confirm whether he has any concerns that the introduction of this penal code in Brunei could have an effect on other countries with majority Muslim populations in the region?
I think my honourable friend makes a very good and wise point in that regard, and certainly there are obviously other countries in that region with majority Muslim populations. There is, I think, possibly also a sense that there is an exception in the Sultanate of Brunei, as he will be well aware, as I say, the connections between that and Saudi Arabia and Qatari doctrine are quite profound. But he makes a good point that, whereas on these related issues we have made significant progress, the very fact that there could be a backward movement is one that we should all be very wary of.
Sandy Martin.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. I do not in any way doubt the sincerity of the Right Honourable Member or indeed of Her Majesty's Government. As he says, nobody should face punishment for who they are or whom they love. However, this does set up real difficulties for this country and for our relationship with such a country. Because, of course, it is entirely possible that we might well have an LGBT member of Her Majesty's Government on official business visiting Brunei. How are we going to cope with that? The movement against apartheid in South Africa, I remember, and I'm sure the Right Honourable Member remembers as well from his childhood, started when the South African regime refused to allow Basil d'Oliveira to play cricket in South Africa. What is our attitude going to be if the Brunei regime starts to make concerns felt about having LGBT members of our armed forces serving in Brunei? We cannot have a sensible relationship with a country which refuses to accept that some people are the way they are. And I feel strongly that more needs to be done from this government in order to ensure that is done. And can I also add, I believe the Right Honourable Member misunderstood my honourable friend from Bristol North West when she was talking about asylum. When she was talking about people who are seeking asylum in this country, you need to have, I believe the Right Honourable Member needs to have a serious conversation with the Home Office.
Order.
Not have
Thank you. Thank you. As it happens, we do have still a lot of business to get through this afternoon. We do have a very well subscribed debate coming next, so I would urge honourable and right honourable members to ask short questions and hopefully short answers as well. Minister.
Short answers, Madam Deputy Speaker, at times. Then I say I very much respect the heartfelt concerns relating from the honourable gentleman for Ipswich. Now, I hope I didn't misunderstand what was said earlier on. I mean, we clearly appreciate this is a Home Office matter, but this is not an issue that we have been able to discuss at great length with them. He makes, I think, a very valid point. I mean, dare I say, anyone who goes to Brunei will recognise just what a welcoming and open place it appears to be, and it seems such at odds with the idea of having a Sharia penal code with all of its potential punishments that are in place. However, please be assured we will not be complacent about this matter, and we will try to ensure that we get some progress along the lines that have been suggested by the members.
Will Quint.
Madam Deputy Speaker, I welcome the Minister's statement and thank him for repeatedly raising concerns regarding these laws with the government of Brunei. The penal code introduced in Brunei is nothing more than barbaric. What more can we do, or the British government do, to put pressure on the government of Brunei and ensure that the strength of opposition from across the world to the introduction of this punishment is felt?
Now, I thank my honourable friend for Colchester, and I think in many ways the sheer strength of expression here, both in the press but actually here in Parliament, I think will make a strong impression in itself, and we will make sure obviously that our counterparts, and in particular our High Commissioner Richard Lindsay, is made well aware of the universal strength of opinion on this matter and the desire to ensure that we have regularise our relations with Brunei, partly by seeing genuine progress amidst the concerns that have been raised here today.
Angela Crawley.
Madam Deputy Speaker, can I echo the sentiments of my honourable friend for Western Bartonshire also and say that I would like to express my own grave concerns about these changes to the penal code for both stoning and amputation. As honourable members have rightly outlined, this not only affects the LGBT community, it affects many potentially young vulnerable children who may be affected, as well as women in particular. So will this government continue to exercise its diplomatic and foreign policy efforts and condemn these practices and ensure that at every opportunity it calls on Brunei to ensure their human rights obligations are upheld? It is shocking and barbaric that in 2019 people can be stoned to death for who they love. So I will call on the Minister to simply make every effort possible to bring Brunei into these compliance.
I thank the Honourable Lady for her words. I agree. And I think the important thing to stress is that these threats against what seem like minorities are actually threats to us all, threats to all of our liberty. And it is that, I think, is the single most important message that we will endeavour to put across.
Ross Thompson.
Much, Madam Deputy Speaker, and I welcome the statement of my right honourable friend and fully endorse the actions that he is saying he will take. Can he advise the House of what he will do to proactively engage with international allies, partners and organisations beyond the Commonwealth to help lobby Brunei to reverse this absolutely abhorrent decision?
But I thank my honourable friend. I think in part what we will obviously try to do is work with a number of the countries that have already expressed grave concerns, and obviously Brunei has a number of other trading partners from the European Union and elsewhere, and we will obviously try to work together, and of course within international organisations such as the United Nations. If I will leave it at that, and obviously we are working on trying to put together some sort of plan, and it may well be that we'll be able to say a little bit more at the Westminster Hall debate that takes place next Wednesday.
So Edward Davey.
Madam Deputy Speaker, can I thank the Minister for his unqualified condemnation of these proposals, these actions by the Brunei government, these appalling new punishments that are an attack on the LGBT+ community and indeed vulnerable men, women and children. But, Madam Deputy Speaker, can we go further than words? I think we need to put our money where our mouth is. The Minister was on a trade visit to Brunei in August last year. His honourable friend, the British trade envoy to Brunei, was on a trade trip to Brunei at the end of last year. We have open trade talks with this government. Can we not just bring those to an end as a very clear signal that we will put our support for human rights and our opposition to human rights abuses above trade links, Brexit or no Brexit?
I think, in fairness, the visit I had last year was actually more to do with the broader diplomatic relationship, which, as I say, is extremely strong, and it will sadden many people who know Brunei or who have Bruneian blood there to recognise just how strong that relationship is, and just the outrage that has come forth over the last couple of days over this issue. For example, we don't import hydrocarbons from Brunei. Obviously, it's a big oil nation, but we believe that having open and honest discussions rather than going down the route of boycotts, for example, would be a best way to encourage Brunei to uphold their international human rights obligations and to respect individual freedoms. And the people-to-people connection is also important. I mean, I'm very proud of the fact that we have had a good track record of achieving scholarships, getting young Bruneians to come to the UK. Perhaps that's one of the best ways of them understanding the different values, but nonetheless the positive values that we have in this country, and return to perhaps play a role in public life in that country.
Sure.
Speaker, I'm very concerned about the implications for the safety of British nationals who are either currently in Brunei or planning to visit Brunei as a result of the shocking introduction of these barbaric and retrograde laws. He said a little bit about the travel advice that has been provided. Can I press him a little more on that? What is that advice now, and how can he be satisfied that British nationals will indeed be protected?
Travel advice changed, obviously, when it was evident that the penal code was likely to come into play. And just simply to explain, there is a penal code, and therefore there are certain behaviours that potentially, under that code, could lead to a variety of punishments. We have and will continue to raise our very specific concerns with the government of Brunei, and hitherto have received reassurances that the common law, rather than Sharia law, will continue to be the primary means of administering justice in Brunei. But we shall continue to provide consular support to any British nationals as needed. Some are obviously there, as I say, working, some in the garrison, and others who visit that country.
Kevin Foster.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. When the right to choose who you love and to be who you are is taken away, it then follows that other rights, including to believe, follow your own God, quickly following being taken away as well. Would the Minister therefore make very clear to the Brunei government, I welcome this statement today, that actually this is not about being devout, this is about being completely misguided?
Well, I think we will perhaps try and find slightly more diplomatic language than that. We do understand that obviously there is a Sharia code that is in play that Brunei have close to their hearts, or at least some in Brunei do. But he makes a fair point. We obviously want to see universality of these values, and that's something that we will press and continue to press for throughout the international community.
Luke Graham.
Thank you very much, Madam Deputy Speaker. I asked my honourable friend what can be done to champion some of the virtues of actually giving people equal rights. When these rights are denied, it is not just a loss for the individual, it is a loss for the society as a whole. We only have to look at our own history to see the denial of rights of individuals like Alan Turing and see the impacts that it has not only on our local communities but also on our entire nation. Imagine how much further forward computing could be if we hadn't sterilised him and pushed him towards the destiny he actually ended up fulfilling. How do we champion these rights internationally and actually pull people towards our vision of a more liberal society so individuals and the society as a whole can benefit?
I think amidst all the frenzy of what's going on at the moment in British political life, it's also worth remembering, go back just over 100 years, the big issue was the rights of women to have a right to vote. It just seems absurd to us that there was even a debate that needed to be had at a time when obviously we have many women who are now legislators, 2 women who have been prime ministers in the last 100 years. Hopefully a few more to come at some point as well. It is, as I say, very important that we actually have to recognise the equality, whether it is gender equality, equality in so many other fields, not just for a country to fulfil its potential economically, but in every other sense, the sheer fulfilment of the potential of all individuals requires that. And that, to be fair, is a message that we, along with many other partners, will try to get across, and we will continue to do that. Madam Deputy Speaker, thank you so much. I'm sorry this has taken a little bit longer than we might all have hoped. While I'm here, if I can just as well as thanking everyone for their contribution, and it's been wonderful to see such unity amongst the House, may I just say, because I can see he's in the House, my next-door neighbour from Poplar and Limehouse, it's his birthday today, so if I could... you must have better things to do than being in the House of Commons on your birthday, on that note, I'd sit.
Point of order, Jim Fitzpatrick. So I'll just use the opportunity. Point of order, Jim Fitzpatrick.
Madam Deputy Speaker, it's very kind of you to allow me the point of order. I'm very grateful to the best wishes from my honourable friend, my next-door neighbour. I think it's very unkind of him to tell the whole world it's my birthday, and at 67, I'm still here. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you for that. Further to that point of order, Bob Neal.
Can I tell my honourable fellow West Ham friend that there's nothing wrong with being 67, but I'm glad he's got there a bit before me.
It's very nice to see an outbreak of good humour. Thank you. We now come to the backbench motion on the introduction of the 2019 loan charge. Ross Thompson to move. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Madam Deputy Speaker. I want to thank the Backbench Business Committee for agreeing to bring forward this very important debate. I want to thank members of the All-Party Parliamentary Group on the loan charge for all of their work today, and thank so many colleagues who have added their names to the motion in front of us today. Because the urgency of today's debate cannot be understated. As of tomorrow, tens of thousands of people and their families will face the huge cost, both physical and emotional, of the loan charge. And HMRC are yet to show any regard to the enormous pain that this legislation has already inflicted on thousands of people across the country. Now, representing Aberdeen South, which